Have you ever paused to wonder about the quieter figures in the grand, thunderous halls of Greek mythology? We all know the mighty Zeus hurling lightning bolts from his throne, or the wise Athena, born fully formed from her father's head. Their stories are told and retold, but what about the ones who moved in the shadows of these colossal personalities, the deities who performed the essential, quiet work that kept the divine world turning? Imagine for a moment the endless feasts on Mount Olympus. The nectar flows like golden rivers, and the ambrosia, the food of the gods, is passed around. But who ensures this celestial celebration never falters? Who is the ever-youthful presence, the cupbearer to the gods themselves, moving gracefully among them, granting renewal with every pour? Her name is Hebe, the goddess of youth, and her story is one of the most overlooked and profoundly beautiful secrets of ancient myth. She is far more than just the gods' bartender. She is the very embodiment of eternal spring, the divine force of rejuvenation that even the immortals relied upon. We're so accustomed to tales of power, conflict, and epic quests that we often miss the quiet miracles happening in the background, the gentle hands that hold the fabric of existence together. Hebe's legacy is woven into this very fabric, a testament to the idea that true power isn't always about storms and strife. Sometimes it's found in the grace of a welcoming smile, the vitality of a new beginning, and the simple, sacred act of service. Today, we embark on a journey to uncover her untold story. We will trace her fascinating origins, explore her pivotal roles that went far beyond serving drinks, and discover a legacy that questions everything we think we know about strength and significance in the ancient world. This is a story not just about a goddess, but about the timeless human yearning for what she represents, the hope for renewal, the blessing of vitality, and the quiet, enduring power of youth itself. Born to the ultimate power couple of the cosmos, Hebe's very existence was a statement. As the daughter of Zeus, the sky father who commanded thunder, and Hera, the formidable queen of marriage and family, she was quite literally divine royalty. This isn't just a minor detail in a long list of mythological family trees. Her parentage was her first and most profound definition. While Zeus fathered many children with various goddesses and mortals, and Hera often stood in furious opposition to these affairs, Hebe was different. She was one of the very few children born from the union of the king and queen themselves, a symbol of their official, sanctioned partnership at the very heart of the Olympian regime. Think of it this way: in a pantheon filled with deities born from strange and violent circumstances, springing from a forehead or emerging from sea foam, Hebe's origin was one of relative stability and legitimacy. She was a product of the established order, a living emblem of the royal house. This lineage immediately set her apart from other minor goddesses or nymphs. She wasn't a peripheral figure, she was central to the family's identity, a constant, youthful presence in the halls of her own immensely powerful parents. Her birth symbolized something essential for the immortal gods themselves, the promise of continuity and renewal right at the core of their power. Even beings who live forever need a reminder of springtime, of vitality, of the fresh energy that a new generation represents. Hebe was that reminder, walking among them. As the child of the two most authoritative figures on Olympus, her role wasn't just assigned, it was inherited. She wasn't merely a servant to the gods, she was their sister, their daughter, their niece, serving them from a place of inherent privilege and profound familial duty. This unique position granted her an intimacy with the ruling council of the cosmos that no other deity could claim, making her the quiet, indispensable heart of the divine household. Her very name, Hebe, is a direct whisper from the ancient Greek world, a single, potent word that means youth or the prime of life. But this was far more than a simple label. It was a declaration of her absolute, fundamental nature. In the worldview of the Greeks, a name held profound power, often capturing the complete essence and destiny of a person or deity. Hebe wasn't just called youth, she was youth itself personified. Think of it as the difference between someone who is simply young and someone who is the living, breathing concept of youth. The vitality in a newborn's first cry, the boundless energy of an athlete at their peak, the flawless bloom of a flower just as it opens to the sun. That ideal state of perfect physical and spiritual vigor, untouched by age or decay, was not just an attribute she possessed, it was her entire being. This core identity made her immensely significant to both gods and mortals, though in profoundly different ways. For the immortal Olympians, Hebe represented a perpetual state of renewal. Even though they could not die, the myths suggest they were not entirely immune to the passage of time or the weariness of eternity. Hebe's presence, and more specifically her sacred duty of serving nectar, was the divine mechanism that continually replenished their divine essence. She was the ever-flowing fountain of their immortality, ensuring that their power never waned and their celestial beauty never faded. She was in effect the guarantee of their eternal prime. For humanity, however, her symbolism was even more poignant and bittersweet. Mortals lived brief, difficult lives where youth was a fleeting, precious season, gone in the blink of an eye. Hebe embodied everything they longed for and everything they were destined to lose. She was the divine expression of that golden, unreachable ideal, a life perpetually in its spring, free from the burdens of aging, sickness, and the slow decline toward death. This is why she was worshipped not just as a distant figure on a mountain, but as a goddess whose favor one might seek for a thriving family, for the health of children, or for a few more years of strength and vitality. Her power represented the one thing that all the gold in the world could not buy, and all the ambition in the human heart could not secure. The desire for what she offered is a thread that runs through all of human history, from the alchemists seeking an elixir of life to our modern culture's fascination with anti-aging remedies. In Hebe, the ancient Greeks gave a face and a name to this most universal and deeply felt human yearning. And so we arrive at her most iconic duty, the role that defined her presence in the Grand Hall of Olympus, Hebe as the divine cupbearer. Picture the scene: the gods assembled in all their radiant power, feasting in a hall that shimmered with golden light. At the center of this celestial gathering, Hebe moved with a grace that was both humble and utterly essential. Her task was to serve the sacred substances of nectar and ambrosia, the very fuel of divinity. This wasn't mundane catering, this was a ritual of profound cosmic importance. Nectar was the drink of the gods, a liquid more potent than any wine, and ambrosia was their food, a substance often described as conferring immortality. The act of consuming these elements was what continually renewed the gods' eternal life, preserving their power and their flawless, ageless beauty. Without this regular sustenance, even the mighty Olympians might find their immortality waning. Hebe, therefore, was not merely a server, she was the keeper of the fountain of youth for the entire pantheon. Her hand, offering the golden cup, was the conduit through which the very essence of eternity flowed. To be entrusted with this duty was an honor of the highest order. In the ancient world, the role of a cupbearer was one of immense trust and intimacy, typically reserved for a beloved son or a favored member of the court. It meant you held the power of life and death in your hands, as you were responsible for ensuring the drink was pure and safe. For the gods, who faced no such mortal dangers, the symbolism was even grander. Hebe's position signified that she was the most trusted, the most pure, and the most integral to the very functioning of their divine society. She had the ear of Zeus, the respect of Hera, and the constant company of the most powerful beings in existence. Her grace in performing this service was seen as a reflection of her own divine nature, youth itself, eternally replenishing and eternally generous. This daily ritual also cemented the social and political order of Olympus. As the gods partook of the nectar and ambrosia from her hand, they were not just sustaining their bodies, they were reaffirming their unity as a council, their shared status as immortals, and their collective reliance on the orderly, graceful service that Hebe provided. She was the quiet, constant heartbeat of their celestial government, the one whose work allowed the debates, the dramas, and the epic decisions to continue uninterrupted. Her role ensured the machinery of divinity never ground to a halt, making her, in a very real sense, one of the most powerful and indispensable figures on the mountain, precisely because her power was expressed not through command but through nourishing sustenance. But what exactly were these miraculous substances that flowed so freely from Hebe's pitcher? To understand her true importance, we need to look closer at the legendary nectar and ambrosia. These weren't just divine versions of fine wine and gourmet food. In the earliest Greek traditions, they were often thought of as the very blood and life force of the gods themselves. Imagine a substance so potent that a single sip could heal the most grievous wounds inflicted in battle, or restore vitality to a fading immortal. Homer, in his epic tales, describes how the goddess Aphrodite, when scratched by a mortal warrior's spear, was whisked back to Olympus. There, her mother Dione cleansed the wound with ambrosia, and the divine flesh was instantly knitted back together, good as new. This shows us that these elements were not merely sustaining, they were actively regenerative, possessing a powerful magic that could reverse damage and decay. For the gods, this was a daily necessity. Their immortality wasn't a static condition but a state that required constant upkeep, a perpetual renewal against the subtle entropies of eternity. Every time Zeus took a golden cup from Hebe's hand, he wasn't just quenching a thirst, he was reaffirming his own eternal sovereignty, topping up the divine essence that made him who he was. The same went for every deity in the hall. Without this regular infusion of life-giving power, their brilliance might have dimmed, their strength might have waned. Hebe's graceful service was therefore the linchpin holding the entire immortal hierarchy in place. She controlled the distribution of the one resource the gods could not do without. This gave her a form of quiet authority that is easy to overlook. While Zeus held the lightning bolt and Poseidon commanded the seas, Hebe held the cup. In a very real sense, she had power over the powerful because their continuous existence depended on her faithful performance of this sacred duty. It's a fascinating dynamic. The youthful goddess, often depicted as serene and gentle, was the one who ensured the thunderer could continue to thunder. This reveals a profound truth within the structure of Greek myth. Raw power is nothing without the sustaining forces that make its continued exercise possible. Hebe represents that sustaining force. Her role transforms from a simple servant to a vital cornerstone of cosmic maintenance. Think of her as the divine systems administrator, the one who keeps the core software of immortality running smoothly, allowing all the other, more dramatic programs to function. This perspective completely reframes our understanding of her significance. She wasn't in the background, she was at the very center, performing the most critical recurring task in all of Olympus. And this central role naturally leads us to a pivotal moment in her story, a transition that would see this eternal youth pass her sacred duty to another, marking one of the most significant successions in all of mythology. So what was it actually like to live that life, day in and day out, within the shimmering, cloud-veiled peak of Mount Olympus? Imagine a realm where the very air hums with latent power, where marble columns stretch so high they seem to hold up the sky, and the floors are polished so brightly they reflect the constellations above. This was Hebe's home, not just a majestic palace, but a vibrant, bustling cosmic capital. Her day likely began not with a frantic rush, but with a sense of serene purpose. As the first soft light of Eos, the dawn, painted the horizon, Hebe would prepare for her most sacred task. We might picture her in a tranquil courtyard, filling her magnificent golden pitcher, the kylix, from an ever-flowing, magical spring, a fountain whose waters were the very source of nectar itself. This wasn't a chore, it was a ritual of preparation, a quiet moment of focus before she stepped into the Grand Megaron, the great hall where the gods would assemble. Stepping into that hall was like entering the heart of the universe. The atmosphere would crackle with the combined energy of the most powerful beings in existence. There, enthroned in the center, would be her father, Zeus, his aura one of formidable, calm authority. Nearby, her mother Hera would preside with a regal and watchful eye. Around them, the full pantheon would gather, the wise and strategic Athena, the fiery and disciplined Ares, the charming but unpredictable Aphrodite. And moving among them all was Hebe. Her grace was her signature. She didn't just walk, she glided, a calming presence in a room often charged with divine tension and epic egos. Think of the countless family dramas and political disputes that played out in that hall, the arguments, the jealousies, the thunderous debates over the fate of nations. Through it all, Hebe performed her duty. She would approach each deity in turn, offering the golden cup with a respectful dip of her head. When Ares, fresh from the battlefield and still radiating fury, would take the cup, the act was a momentary cooling of his wrath. When the ever-scheming Hera accepted the drink, it was a daughter serving a mother, a brief, personal connection amidst the grand politics. For the witty and mischievous Hermes, a quick sip might be accompanied by a clever remark, which Hebe would likely acknowledge with a gentle, knowing smile. She wasn't just a silent automaton, she was an interactive, living part of their divine society, a constant, reassuring presence they all knew and relied upon. Her role granted her a unique front-row seat to all of Olympus's affairs, yet she remained above the fray, her own youthful purity a silent commentary on the often turbulent lives of the immortals around her. Beyond the grand feasts, her life was woven into the daily fabric of the divine household. As the goddess of youth, her influence permeated the very atmosphere of the mountain. Wherever she walked, flowers might bloom a little brighter, the air might feel a little fresher, and a sense of vitality would follow. She was the embodiment of Olympus's eternal spring. We can imagine her tending to the divine gardens, places where mythical plants like the golden apples of the Hesperides grew, perhaps even under her care. She might have been a companion to the younger goddesses, a serene older sister figure to deities like Artemis, or a calming influence on the muses, and consider her relationship with her own family. As the daughter of Hera, she likely assisted her mother in matters of the hearth and home, learning the intricacies of managing the most important household in existence. She was, in many ways, the perfect daughter of Olympus, beautiful, dutiful, and eternally gracious. Her existence was a harmonious blend of solemn duty and divine privilege. She lived in the most glorious home imaginable, surrounded by her immensely powerful family, and her work, while constant, was one of honor and central importance. There was no other deity who could claim such intimate, daily access to every single Olympian, and no other whose simple, repeated action was so fundamentally tied to the continued existence of their entire world. Hebe's life was a beautiful paradox. She was both the serene centerpiece of the grandest court in the cosmos and the humble, essential worker who kept its engine running. To understand Hebe's place in her family, we need to look at the fascinating and contrasting roles of her siblings, because the children of Zeus and Hera were not just a random assortment of deities. They were a carefully curated portfolio of essential and often opposing life forces. Her immediate siblings were Ares, the formidable god of war, and Eileithyia, the revered goddess of childbirth and midwifery. On the surface, this seems like a wildly disparate trio. One sister brings life gently into the world, another sustains it eternally, and their brother is the embodiment of its violent end. Yet, when you view them as a complete set, a profound and coherent picture of Hera's domain emerges. As the queen of marriage, women, and the family unit, Hera presided over the entire cycle of life, from its sacred beginnings to its often tumultuous middle and the preservation of its prime. Her children perfectly encapsulate this vast responsibility. Eileithyia represents the absolute inception, the moment of arrival, the pain and joy of bringing a new soul into existence. She was the divine midwife, invoked by women in labor to ensure a safe delivery, a goddess whose presence was required at the birth of almost every major hero and Olympian, including her own brother Apollo. Her role was one of intense, focused power at the threshold of life. Then, once that life was thriving, Hebe took over, personifying its most ideal state, the vibrant, energetic, and flawless period of youth. She was the sustainer of this prime condition, both for mortals in their brief golden years and for gods in their eternal splendor. And then there was Ares. If Eileithyia governed life's beginning and Hebe its beautiful peak, Ares represented the brutal, chaotic force that could end it prematurely on the battlefield. He was the raw, untamed spirit of conflict, bloodshed, and courage in the face of mortality. This dynamic creates a stunning narrative symmetry within a single family. One sister ushers you in, the other maintains you in your best state, and your brother might be the reason you leave prematurely. They are three facets of the same cosmic truth about existence. Now, consider the specific relationship between Hebe and Ares, which is one of the most compelling sibling dynamics in all of Greek mythology. Imagine the contrast in their daily routines. Hebe spent her days in the radiant, orderly hall of Olympus, moving with serene grace, distributing the nectar that sustained life and harmony among the gods. Ares, on the other hand, was most at home on the grim, dusty plains of battle, surrounded by the sounds of clashing metal and dying men, his very presence inciting the frenzy and bloodlust of war. He was often depicted as volatile, impulsive, and even somewhat brutish, the least popular god among the Olympians, save perhaps his mother Hera, who nonetheless supported his warmongering. So, what would their interactions have been like when Ares returned to Olympus, weary and bloodstained from the battlefield? The myths give us a poignant clue. In Homer's Iliad, when Ares is wounded by the mortal hero Diomedes, he flees to Olympus in immense pain. It is Zeus who sternly reprimands him, but it is likely Hebe who acted as the divine medic. With her deep connection to vitality and renewal, she would have been the one to cleanse his wound, perhaps with ambrosia, and restore his divine form. In this moment, the goddess of youth becomes the healer of the god of war. She doesn't just serve him a refreshing drink, she actively repairs the damage his domain has inflicted upon him. This transforms their relationship from one of simple contrast to one of essential interdependence. Ares creates the chaos, and Hebe, in a way, cleans up after it, at least for the gods. She is the soothing balm to his destructive fire, the calm after his storm. This sibling bond illustrates a profound understanding that even the most violent and disruptive forces in the universe require a counterbalancing power of healing and rejuvenation to prevent total collapse. Hebe's gentle, life-affirming energy was the necessary antidote to her brother's deadly profession, a quiet reminder that even for the god of war, there must be a return to wholeness. The third piece of this familial puzzle is Eileithyia, the sister who completes the cycle. While less famous in popular retellings, her role was absolutely fundamental. As the goddess of childbirth, she held the power of life and death over every mother and newborn in the ancient world. The Greeks believed that if Eileithyia was absent or displeased, labor could be prolonged indefinitely with tragic consequences. She was the divine catalyst, the one whose presence allowed the miracle of birth to proceed. This connects her intimately to Hebe, not through contrast but through a beautiful progression. Eileithyia's domain is the gateway. She oversees the perilous journey of a new life entering the world. Once that life has safely arrived, it immediately falls under the auspices of Hebe's broader domain. The infant's health, its growth into a strong child, its journey through the golden years of youth, all of this was the expression of Hebe's power. Think of them as two specialists working in different departments of the same great hospital of life. Eileithyia is the brilliant obstetrician in the delivery room, performing the critical, high-stakes work of bringing a patient into the world. Once stable, the patient is then passed to Hebe, the premier specialist in pediatric and adolescent health, whose goal is to nurture that life to its most flourishing state. They represent two consecutive chapters in the story of a mortal life, or the perpetual state of a god. This relationship highlights that youth is not a beginning in itself, but a glorious phase that follows a successful beginning. You could not have Hebe's blessing of a vibrant youth without first having Eileithya's blessing of a safe birth. Together, the sisters managed the most hopeful and cherished part of the human experience, while their brother managed its most feared and inevitable aspect. This intricate family dynamic shows that the children of Zeus and Hera were not random. They were a divine dream team, each managing a critical sector of the cosmos's portfolio. Hebe, often seen as a simple maiden, was in fact a crucial anchor in this powerful triad, her gentle power of sustenance standing squarely between the creative force of her sister and the destructive force of her brother. To truly grasp the immense importance of a goddess like Hebe, we have to step away from the golden halls of Olympus for a moment and understand the world of the people who worshipped her. In ancient Greece, youth, or Hebe, was not just a phase of life, it was a cultural obsession, a fleeting, precious commodity imbued with almost sacred value. This wasn't the casual appreciation for young people we might see today. It was a profound, collective reverence for a specific, narrow window of human potential, a time when the body was at its physical peak, unmarred by age, and the spirit was brimming with the promise of the future. For the Greeks, life was often harsh, brutal, and short. Medical knowledge was limited, plagues could decimate cities, and the physical toll of manual labor or warfare was immense. Reaching a healthy, vigorous adulthood was in itself a significant achievement. Because of this, the state of youth represented the absolute pinnacle of human existence, the perfect fusion of strength, beauty, and vitality. It was the raw material from which heroes were forged, citizens were made, and the future of the city-state was secured. This is why Greek art, from the serene Kouros statues to the powerful discus throwers, is almost exclusively dedicated to depicting the idealized young body. They weren't just creating art, they were sculpting an aspiration, carving in marble the physical manifestation of their highest cultural ideal. This cultural obsession translated directly into a series of crucial and highly ritualized transitions that marked a young person's journey into full membership of society. For young men, the path to citizenship was paved with rigorous training and public ceremony. In the militaristic society of Sparta, this meant the infamous agoge, a state-sponsored program of extreme discipline, physical endurance, and military training designed to strip away individuality and forge the boy into a perfect hoplite soldier, a living weapon for the state. His youth was not his own, it was a resource to be honed and dedicated entirely to the survival and glory of Sparta. In Athens, while less brutal, the process was no less significant. An Athenian boy would undergo the dokimasia, a public examination to prove his citizen birth and his fitness to be enrolled in his father's deme or township. This was followed by 2 years of mandatory military service as an epheb, patrolling the borders and learning the arts of war. His successful passage through this stage was a public declaration that he was ready to transition from a private youth to a public man, with all the rights and responsibilities of voting, holding office, and defending the city. His youthful strength was the city's first line of defense. For young women, the rituals were more private but equally vital, centered entirely on the transition from maiden or parthenos to married woman. A girl's youth was a time of seclusion and preparation where she learned the domestic skills of weaving, managing a household, and raising children. Her most significant ritual was often the dedication of her childhood toys or a lock of her hair to a goddess like Artemis, symbolizing the end of her carefree girlhood and her readiness for marriage and motherhood. In Athens, the role of the Ahephoroi, 2 or 4 young girls from noble families chosen to live on the Acropolis and assist in weaving the sacred peplos for the statue of Athena, was a supreme honor. These rituals underscored a universal truth. A young woman's fertility and her successful transition to wifehood were considered a direct contribution to the stability and future population of the state. Her youth was the vessel for the next generation of citizens. In both cases, for young men and women, this stage of life was a precarious bridge between childhood and adulthood, a time of immense pressure and expectation where their physical prime was directly harnessed for the benefit of the family and the city. It was a fleeting resource that had to be utilized perfectly before it was gone. And this is precisely where the goddess Hebe transcends her mythical role and becomes an utterly essential figure for the ancient Greek psyche. She was the divine personification of this entire, cherished, and anxiety-producing life stage. When a community looked upon its strong, young men training in the gymnasium or its beautiful, graceful maidens in a religious procession, they were seeing a living reflection of Hebe's power. She embodied that perfect, unblemished state they all idealized, but her symbolism cut even deeper, touching on the profound vulnerability inherent in this ideal. Youth, by its very nature, is temporary. It is a flower that blooms brilliantly for one season before inevitably beginning to wilt. For a culture so enamored with this state, its inevitable loss was a source of deep existential anxiety. Hebe, in her eternal, unchanging youth on Olympus, represented the impossible dream, the hope that this perfect state could somehow be frozen, preserved forever. She was the divine answer to humanity's most painful confrontation with mortality. While mortals watched their own strength fade and their beauty wither, Hebe remained forever in her prime, a constant, bittersweet reminder of what every human was destined to lose. This is why her worship was not just an abstract admiration, it was a plea. Parents might pray to her for the health and vitality of their children, hoping to secure her blessing for the next generation. Young athletes might invoke her name before a competition, seeking a flash of her divine vigor. She was the guardian of that precious, fragile, and most valuable phase of life, making her one of the most relatable and empathetically worshipped deities in the entire pantheon, a divine comfort for a fundamentally mortal condition. If we want to truly see Hebe through the eyes of the people who revered her, we need to look beyond the ancient texts and into the vibrant world of their art. Here, painted on the curved surfaces of clay vases and carved into cool, white marble, her image comes to life in a way words alone cannot capture. The most common and instantly recognizable depiction of Hebe is, unsurprisingly, as the divine cupbearer in the midst of her sacred duty. On countless red figure and black figure vases, we see her standing gracefully among the assembled gods of Olympus. She is almost always shown holding her signature attributes, a shallow, two-handled drinking cup known as a kylix, and a graceful pitcher, the oinocho, from which she is about to pour the precious nectar. Her posture is one of serene motion, often captured in the moment just before she serves Zeus or another deity. This wasn't just a random scene, it was a powerful visual shorthand that immediately identified her to any ancient Greek viewer. The cup and pitcher were as integral to her identity as the trident was to Poseidon or the bow was to Artemis. These objects defined her primary function and, by extension, her essential nature. But it's in the details of these artistic representations where we find deeper meaning. Hebe is consistently portrayed as the epitome of youthful beauty, but it's a specific kind of beauty. Unlike Aphrodite, who is often depicted with a mature, sensual allure, or Athena, who carries a severe, wise countenance, Hebe's beauty is that of a maiden in the first blush of adulthood. Her face is typically round and soft, her expression calm and often slightly demure. She is usually shown wearing a simple, flowing chiton, a type of tunic that emphasizes her slender, graceful form rather than a queenly, ornate gown. This deliberate artistic choice reinforces her role not as a powerful queen or a fearsome warrior, but as a dutiful daughter and an essential servant. Her youth is her defining characteristic, and the artists took great care to ensure that she never looked older, more authoritative, or more imposing than the gods she served. This visual language communicated a clear social hierarchy. Even as a goddess in her own right, her power was expressed through grace and service, a reflection of the ancient Greek values surrounding the idealized behavior of young women. Moving from the intimate scale of vase painting to the grandeur of sculpture, we encounter some of the most celebrated representations of Hebe, which further develop her iconography. Perhaps the most famous is the statue by the neoclassical sculptor Antonio Canova, created in the early 19th century. While this is a much later work, it brilliantly captures the classical ideal of the goddess. Canova's Hebe is a vision of ethereal grace, seemingly floating on tiptoe, her drapery swirling around her as if caught in a gentle breeze. In one hand, she holds a cup aloft, and in the other, a pitcher, her gaze directed downward with a gentle, almost shy expression. The sculpture is a masterpiece of lightness and movement, perfectly embodying the concept of fleeting youth. But even in earlier, purely classical Greek and Roman statues, the themes remain consistent. She is often shown in a contrapposto stance, a relaxed pose that gives the figure a sense of natural, easy movement, as if she has just paused in her rounds. These sculptures were not merely decorative, they were cult statues, objects of veneration in temples and sanctuaries. To stand before such a statue was to be in the direct presence of the divine concept of youth itself, an experience designed to inspire both admiration and a poignant awareness of its transient nature in mortal life. Beyond her core attributes, other symbolic elements sometimes appear in her artworks, adding layers to her story. On some vases, she is depicted near an eagle, the sacred bird of her father, Zeus. This placement immediately establishes her royal lineage and her privileged position within the Olympian family. In other scenes, particularly those illustrating the story of her marriage to the hero Heracles, her iconography shifts slightly. She might be shown handing him the cup of nectar, symbolizing his acceptance into the ranks of the immortals and his attainment of eternal youth through his union with her. This act transforms her from a general servant of the gods to a specific bestower of immortality for her husband, highlighting the personal and romantic dimension of her power. Another fascinating, though less common, motif is her association with the fountain of youth. While this concept is more prominent in later European folklore, its roots can be traced back to the symbolism of Hebe's ever-flowing pitcher. The vessel from which she pours the rejuvenating nectar can be seen as a direct parallel to a magical, life-giving spring, forever replenishing the vitality of the gods. So, what do these recurring artistic motifs tell us about how the average Greek person perceived and worshipped Hebe? The consistency of her image across centuries and different mediums, from humble household vases to grandiose temple statues, suggests a stable and widely understood identity. When a craftsman painted her on a wine cup or a sculptor carved her likeness for a sanctuary, they were tapping into a shared cultural vocabulary. The viewer instantly recognized her as the bringer of renewal, the embodiment of a cherished ideal. This visual ubiquity made her a constant, accessible presence in daily life. A common Athenian might encounter her image on a vase used at a symposium, a drinking party, a direct and fitting context that would invite reflection on her role as the server of the god's own drink. For a young woman, seeing a statue of Hebe's graceful, modest form could serve as a model of aspirational behavior, the ideal maiden before marriage. The art tells us that Hebe was not a distant, abstract concept, but a tangible and relatable divine force. Her worship was likely less about grand, public festivals and more about personal, familial devotion. Parents might have made small offerings at a local shrine dedicated to Hebe, praying for the health and vitality of their children, asking that they too might enjoy the radiant prime of life that the goddess so perfectly represented. In the end, the silent language of art speaks volumes, revealing Hebe as a goddess whose power was found not in thunderous might, but in the quiet, essential, and beautifully depicted grace of eternal youth. This union between the eternal maiden and the ultimate mortal hero might seem like an unexpected twist in the myth, but it was in fact a carefully orchestrated resolution to one of the most turbulent storylines in all of Greek mythology, the saga of Heracles. To understand why this marriage happened, we have to revisit the complicated, often tragic, relationship between Heracles and Hebe's own mother, Hera. From the moment of his birth, the great hero was the target of Hera's infamous wrath. His very name, Heracles, means glory of Hera, an attempt by his mortal parents to appease the queen of the gods, but it did nothing to quell her fury. He was a living, breathing reminder of her husband Zeus's infidelity, born from the mortal woman Alcmene. Hera's persecution of Heracles was relentless. She sent serpents to kill him in his cradle, later inflicted a madness upon him that led to the horrific murder of his own wife and children, and orchestrated the famous 12 labors as a form of penance for that crime, labors she made sure were as deadly and humiliating as possible. Their relationship was the definition of divine antagonism, so the idea that Hera would ultimately give her own cherished daughter in marriage to her greatest enemy is a stunning reversal that demands an explanation. This wasn't a random romantic match, it was a profound act of political and cosmic reconciliation. After Heracles completed his labors and endured a painful, fiery death on a funeral pyre, he achieved what few mortals ever did, apotheosis, a full transformation into a god. He was welcomed onto Olympus, his mortal sufferings finally over, but his position there was precarious. He was the new guy, a former mortal in a realm of beings born divine, and his primary tormentor was the queen herself. For the divine court to function, this lingering hostility had to be resolved. The marriage to Hebe was the ultimate peace treaty, a brilliant symbolic solution that permanently healed the rift. By giving Heracles her daughter's hand in marriage, Hera was not just accepting him, she was formally adopting him into her own family. He became her son-in-law, a member of the royal household. This act transformed him from an illegitimate, resented offspring of Zeus into a legitimate and honored member of Hera's own lineage. All past grievances were ceremonially washed away, and Heracles' place on Olympus was secured not just by Zeus's decree, but by Hera's blessing. Beyond this political reconciliation, the marriage carried immense symbolic weight, creating a perfect poetic balance. Think about the core natures of the two deities involved. Heracles, in his mortal life, was the embodiment of immense physical strength and grueling labor. His entire story is one of struggle, pain, and overcoming impossible challenges through sheer force and endurance. His body was a tool of conquest, but also a vessel for immense suffering, which aged and wearied him throughout his legendary tasks. He represents the heroic but ultimately exhausting journey of a mortal life lived at its absolute limits. Now place him next to Hebe. She is the very essence of renewal, the personification of that vibrant, untarnished energy that is the exact opposite of weariness. She never tires, never ages, and her primary function is to restore and rejuvenate. Their union, therefore, is the ultimate divine remedy. In marrying Hebe, the hero who had endured so much was granted permanent access to the fountain of youth he had so desperately earned. She became his personal source of eternal renewal, ensuring that the toll of his mortal struggles would be forever erased. He would never again know fatigue or decay. His divine strength would now be perpetually sustained by her eternal youth. This transforms their marriage from a simple political arrangement into a deeply meaningful cosmic partnership. Hebe, in a sense, completes Heracles. His apotheosis made him immortal, but her presence made that immortality truly blissful. He gained not just eternal life, but an eternal prime, a forever state of the vitality he had possessed in his greatest mortal moments. For the Greeks, this was a profoundly satisfying conclusion to the hero's arduous journey. It answered a fundamental human question: what is the reward for a life of unparalleled hardship? The answer was not just a seat among the gods, but a permanent union with the very concept of rejuvenation itself. The weary warrior finally found rest not in sleep but in an everlasting spring. This marriage also marked a significant and transformative moment for Hebe herself, redefining her role in the divine hierarchy. Prior to this union, she was the eternal cupbearer, the maiden daughter who served the gods. Marriage, especially to a figure as prominent as Heracles, signaled her transition into a new phase of divine identity, that of a wife and potentially a mother. Interestingly, this shift in her personal status coincided with a change in her professional duties. In many versions of the myth, after her marriage to Heracles, she steps down from her role as the official cupbearer to the gods. This position is then famously filled by Ganymede, a beautiful Trojan prince whom Zeus, in the form of an eagle, abducted and brought to Olympus to serve in her place. This succession is rich with meaning. On one level, it simply reflects Hebe's new status. As a married goddess, her responsibilities now centered on her own household with Heracles. But on a deeper level, it underscores the theme of completion. Her work of serving nectar was the act of sustaining the gods' immortality, and in marrying Heracles, she performed the ultimate act of sustaining. She became the personal guarantor of immortality and eternal youth for her husband, a deified mortal who represented all of humanity's potential for elevation. Her power became focused, intimate, and profoundly personal. She didn't stop being the goddess of youth, she channeled that power into a new, sacred partnership. This also elevated her in the eyes of worshippers. She was no longer just a peripheral maiden figure, but a central player in the conclusion of the greatest hero's saga. She became a symbol of the reward that awaits after great trials, the beautiful, rejuvenating peace that follows a life of chaos and effort. For ordinary people, this made her more relatable. They could pray to her not just for the youth of their children, but for their own hope of renewal after their personal struggles, seeing in her union with Heracles a divine promise that endurance could ultimately lead to restoration. So what would life have been like for this newly formed divine couple, now united on the cloud-wreathed summit of Olympus? If we paint the scene with the brush of mythic logic, their home would have been a place of fascinating contrasts, a divine household blending the echoes of immense struggle with the serene atmosphere of eternal renewal. Picture a magnificent pavilion or palace suite, perhaps granted to them by Zeus himself as a wedding gift. On one side, you might find the trappings of Heracles' hard-won glory, his iconic lion skin cloak draped over a chair, his massive club resting in a corner as a trophy of his mortal past, a quiver of arrows leaning against a wall. These objects were no longer tools of survival but relics of a legendary journey, constant reminders of the brutal path that led him here. And moving through this space, the calming presence of Hebe, her very essence acting as a gentle counterbalance to these symbols of raw, heroic exertion. Her influence would have filled their home with a sense of perpetual spring. Perhaps the air always carried the faint scent of blooming flowers, and the light seemed softer, more golden. This was the perfect environment for the weary hero to finally, truly rest. His immense strength remained, but the constant agony of his labors, the ache in his muscles from holding up the sky, the phantom pain of the poisoned shirt that killed him, was forever soothed by her proximity. She was his living, breathing reprieve. This partnership also fundamentally transformed Heracles' standing among the other gods. Before the marriage, he was the newcomer, the deified mortal who had to prove his worth. But by becoming Hera's son-in-law, his integration into the divine family was complete and unassailable. He was no longer just Zeus's favored son, he was now formally woven into the lineage of the queen. This likely changed the dynamics of the divine assemblies. Where once he might have been viewed with curiosity or even slight condescension by gods born to immortality, he now held a position of respected authority. He had married the princess, as it were, and in doing so secured his legacy. one can imagine him standing beside Hebe during the great feasts, no longer a guest but family, his presence a permanent fixture. His legendary temper and impulsiveness, which caused so much trouble in his mortal life, might have been tempered not just by time but by Hebe's calming influence. Theirs could have been a partnership where her grace softened his edges and his strength provided a formidable protectiveness. They became Olympus's ultimate power couple, not through conquest, but through a union that symbolized the complete journey from mortal trial to divine bliss. And what of their legacy? The question of children is a fascinating one, as it moves their story from a personal union to a dynastic one. While not featured in Homer or the most widely known myths, later sources like the ancient geographer Pausanias mention that Hebe and Heracles had two sons, Alexias and Anicetus. Their names are incredibly telling and poetic. Alexias translates roughly to "he who wards off war" or "the unconquerable," while Anicetus means "the invincible." These are not the names of gentle youth deities. They are the names of warriors, protectors. This suggests that the offspring of the goddess of youth and the god of heroic strength embodied a new, refined concept of power, an invincibility that was perpetually sustained by renewal. Think of it this way: Heracles in his mortal life was incredibly strong, but he could be wounded, poisoned, and driven to madness. He was victorious, but not inherently invincible. His sons, however, born from a union with the very source of rejuvenation, would represent a state of being that could not be overcome. Their strength would be eternal and unassailable, a divine form of protection that never wanes. In some interpretations, they were even said to guard the gates of Olympus itself, a fitting role for the grandsons of Zeus and Hera. They symbolized the ultimate evolution of their father's legacy, raw heroism perfected and made permanent through the blessing of eternal youth. Considering this family unit allows us to see Hebe in a completely new light. She transitions from the maiden cupbearer into a matriarch. As the mother of Alexias and Anicetus, her domain of youth expands. She is no longer just the personification of an individual's prime, but also the source of that vitality for a new generation of divine beings. Her power becomes generative, ensuring that the invincibility of her sons is forever renewed, much as she once renewed the gods with nectar. This completes her arc beautifully. She begins as the daughter serving the established order, becomes the wife who heals the greatest rift in that order, and culminates as the mother who secures its future with a new kind of divine guardian. Her story, when viewed alongside Heracles, is one of quiet, transformative influence. While his glory was earned through loud, world-altering labors, her power worked in the background, facilitating reconciliations, offering solace, and nurturing the next era of divine power. Together, they represent the harmonious balance that even the gods required, the perfect union of hard-won strength and everlasting grace. Yet even in the perfection of Olympus, change was inevitable, and one of the most intriguing transitions in all of mythology began with a single, uncharacteristic misstep. The Eternal Maiden, the very picture of grace, was said to have stumbled. In the most common version of the tale, during one of the grand feasts as she moved among the assembled deities with a golden pitcher, Hebe's foot caught, perhaps on the hem of her own gown or on some unseen imperfection in the polished floor. She tripped, and in that sudden lapse of poise, she spilled the precious nectar or dropped the sacred cup itself. For a moment, the flawless rhythm of the divine court was broken. In that hall where appearances and protocol were everything, such a public lapse was more than a simple accident. It was a profound breach of decorum. The silence that followed would have been deafening. This stumble, seemingly so minor, became the catalyst for her departure from the role that had defined her for so long. It's a story that feels almost shockingly human, a reminder that even the personification of youth and grace could have an off day, a moment of very mortal clumsiness that had immortal consequences. But the myth isn't quite so straightforward, and other ancient sources offer different, equally fascinating explanations for this pivotal change. Another tradition suggests that Hebe's departure from her role was not a dismissal following a mistake, but a voluntary and graceful retirement prompted by her marriage to Heracles. In this version, the union we just explored naturally necessitated a shift in her duties. As a bride and a new wife, her responsibilities now centered on her own divine household. To continue serving as a cupbearer, a role typically filled by an unwed youth, would have been seen as beneath her new station as the wife of a major god. This interpretation reframes the entire event not as a fall from grace, but as a dignified promotion. She wasn't replaced because she failed, she moved on because she had achieved a higher purpose. A third, more poetic variant weaves the two stories together, suggesting that the stumble itself occurred during her wedding ceremony, a moment of understandable distraction or joyous fluster as she transitioned from one life to another. This blends the humanizing element of the accident with the celebratory reason for her departure, making the stumble a symbolic act, a literal trip over the threshold into a new existence. These different versions give us a rich tapestry of meaning. Was it a clumsy error, a dignified retirement, or a symbolic rite of passage? The fact that the ancient world preserved all these possibilities shows they understood the event's complexity. It wasn't just about a job change on Olympus, it was a story about growth, change, and the inevitable passing of time, even for those who are eternally young. The implications of this transition, regardless of the cause, were significant for Hebe's status among the gods. If we view it through the lens of the stumble, it could be interpreted as a slight diminishment of her standing. To be publicly witnessed in a moment of imperfection and then relieved of her central duty could be seen as a loss of favor or a tarnishing of her pristine image. The role of cupbearer was one of ultimate trust and purity. A single lapse could theoretically call that purity into question. However, this is a rather superficial reading. A deeper look suggests that her status was transformed rather than diminished. By marrying Heracles and stepping away from a service role, Hebe evolved from a perpetual maiden, a Kura, into a powerful wife, a Gyne. In the hierarchical world of the gods, this was often an increase in authority and influence. She was no longer the daughter who served, but a matron with her own household and a formidable husband. Her power became more consolidated and personal. Think of it as a corporate analogy. She moved from a highly visible, critical frontline position to an executive role with more strategic influence behind the scenes. Her essential nature as the goddess of youth didn't vanish, it was simply recontextualized. Instead of dispensing youth to all the gods, she now became the specific source of eternal renewal for her deified husband, focusing her power on a single, profound partnership that cemented her place in the Olympian family tree for good. And who was the figure chosen to fill the void she left? The answer introduces one of the most beautiful and complex characters in Greek myth, Ganymede, a mortal Trojan prince of extraordinary beauty. The story goes that Zeus himself, captivated by the youth's radiance, transformed into an eagle, or sent his eagle, to swoop down from Mount Olympus and carry Ganymede away to the heavenly realm. There, the young prince was granted immortality and the esteemed position of divine cupbearer. The contrast between the two holders of this office is striking and deeply meaningful. Hebe attained the role through birthright as the legitimate daughter of the king and queen. Her service was an extension of her familial duty and her innate divine nature. Ganymede, on the other hand, was an outsider, a mortal chosen not for lineage but for his breathtaking beauty. His appointment was an act of Zeus's personal desire. This shift from a female goddess of youth to a beautiful mortal youth as cupbearer also reflects a different aspect of the role. While Hebe embodied the abstract, life-giving power of youth, Ganymede's story highlights the erotic and aesthetic appeal of youthful male beauty, a common theme in Greek culture. His presence on Olympus served as a constant, beautiful reminder of the mortal world below, a world the gods were forever fascinated by and intervened in. The succession, therefore, wasn't merely a personnel change. It signaled a subtle shift in the cosmic order, reflecting Zeus's personal power to elevate mortals and introducing a new dynamic into the heart of the divine court. The eternal, inherent youth of a goddess was replaced by the bestowed immortality of a human boy, making the serving of nectar an act that now bridged the gap between heaven and earth. And so, with the graceful departure of Hebe, the stage was set for a new, and in many ways more complex, figure to take up the golden pitcher. Enter Ganymede, the mortal prince of Troy, whose story would become one of the most poignant and layered in all of Greek mythology. His arrival on Olympus was not one of birthright, but of abduction, a tale that reveals as much about the capricious nature of the gods as it does about the evolving symbolism of the cupbearer role itself. The most famous version of the story, immortalized in Homer's Iliad, tells us that Ganymede was the most beautiful of all mortal men, a youth whose radiance captivated Zeus himself. Unable to resist, the king of the gods transformed into a mighty eagle, or dispatched his divine eagle companion, and swooped down from the heavens to the plains of Troy. There, the great bird gently, or perhaps not so gently, seized the young prince in its talons and carried him away to the eternal home of the gods. This was not an invitation. It was a divine seizure, an act of power that underscores the immense gulf between the desires of the Olympians and the autonomy of the humans they ruled over. Once on the mountain, Ganymede was granted the gift of immortality and appointed to the now vacant position of cupbearer to the gods. But this gift was double-edged, for it came at the cost of his mortal life, his family, and his freedom. He was elevated to the highest honor a mortal could dream of, yet his story begins with a profound loss, setting the tone for a role that was inherently different from the one Hebe had occupied. The contrast between the two cupbearers could not be more striking, and it is in this contrast that we see a significant shift in the divine worldview. Hebe was youth itself, a goddess born into her role, serving her own family in a duty that was an extension of her innate divine nature. Her service was stable, legitimate, and born of the established cosmic order. Ganymede, on the other hand, was an outsider, a mortal elevated solely on the basis of his extraordinary physical beauty. Where Hebe's appointment was about function and familial duty, Ganymede's was about desire and aesthetics. His presence introduced a new energy into the hall of Olympus. He represented the ideal of pederastic love that was common in ancient Greek society, the admiration of an older, powerful man for the beauty and potential of a younger male. Zeus's affection for Ganymede was not a secret. It was a central part of the myth, and in some versions, Ganymede becomes the king's cupbearer and also his lover. This adds a layer of personal intimacy to the role that was not present with Hebe. The position was no longer just about a daughter serving her father's court. It was now also about a god's personal attachment to a beautiful mortal youth. This changed the dynamics of power within the hall. The act of serving nectar, once a symbol of cosmic renewal performed by a goddess, now also became a symbol of the god's ability to pluck the most beautiful things from the mortal world and claim them for their own pleasure. This shift also reflects a deeper philosophical tension between the inherent and the bestowed. Hebe's power was inherent, she was youth, and her service flowed from that essential truth. Ganymede's immortality, however, was a gift, something granted from the outside. He did not embody a concept, he was a mortal who had been made immortal, a beautiful object that had been elevated to a position of sacred service. This distinction would have resonated deeply with a Greek audience. It spoke to the human condition itself, the longing for the divine, and the painful awareness that such elevation was not something one could earn through virtue alone, but was often a capricious gift from powers beyond one's control. Ganymede's beauty was his ticket to heaven, a thought that is both enchanting and terribly unsettling. his story asks a difficult question. Is it a blessing to be chosen by the gods, even if that choice rips you from everything you have ever known? The myths are largely silent on Ganymede's own feelings about his fate, but that silence is itself deafening. We are left to wonder if he viewed his golden cup as a privilege or as a chain, if he looked out from Olympus with awe at his new home or with a heartbreaking longing for the Trojan plains of his youth. The reaction back on Earth to this divine intervention was, as one might expect, one of profound grief mixed with a strange form of honor. Ganymede's father, King Tros of Troy, was heartbroken at the disappearance of his son. In some versions of the myth, Zeus, perhaps feeling a pang of guilt or simply wishing to smooth over a messy situation, sends the messenger god Hermes down to Troy with gifts and an explanation. Hermes assures the grieving king that his son has not been killed but has been taken to live among the gods, granted eternal life and an honored position. As compensation, Zeus gives the king a pair of magnificent divine horses, faster than the wind, or in other accounts, a golden vine crafted by the god Hephaestus. This transaction is deeply revealing. It shows that even the gods understood the need to compensate for their transgressions, to turn a violent abduction into a diplomatic arrangement. For the Trojans, the story became a source of immense pride. Their prince was so beautiful that the king of the gods himself could not resist him. Ganymede's apotheosis was woven into the foundation myths of the city, a divine connection that they believed placed them under the special, if complicated, watch of Olympus. This local pride, however, does little to erase the fundamental imbalance of the story. It remains a powerful narrative about the sheer, unilateral power of the gods and the vulnerability of even the most royal and beautiful mortals before their whims. Back on Olympus, the presence of Ganymede completed a fascinating thematic triangle at the heart of Zeus's reign, reflecting the different facets of his power and desire. If we consider his wife Hera as the goddess of official, sanctioned marriage and family, and his many other lovers as representations of his wanderlust and connection to various aspects of the cosmos, then Ganymede occupied a unique and specific niche. He was the eternal, beautiful youth, the personal object of the king's affection who lived in his house and served at his table. This relationship, while controversial to modern sensibilities, was codified in the ancient world. The constellation Aquarius, the water-bearer, is often identified as Ganymede, forever immortalized in the stars, pouring out his pitcher not of nectar but of heavenly waters. This celestial honor signifies the profound cultural impact of his myth. He became a symbol of the soul's ascent to the divine, of the mortal being chosen for eternal glory. And in his daily role, he performed the same essential function as Hebe, but the meaning of that function had transformed. When Ganymede offered the cup to Zeus, it was not just a daughter serving her father. It was a mortal serving his captor and patron, a beautiful youth fulfilling the desire of the most powerful being in existence. This shift from a familial model to a model based on erotic desire and aesthetic appreciation marks a significant evolution in how the Greeks imagined the inner workings of their gods. The divine court was not a static, perfectly ordered bureaucracy. It was a dynamic, sometimes messy, reflection of very human passions and power structures, all playing out on an immortal scale. The replacement of Hebe with Ganymede was far more than a change of staff. It was a shift in the very mythology, introducing a story that grappled with beauty, power, consent, and the bittersweet price of immortality. So far, we've seen Hebe as the graceful cupbearer and the divine spouse, but perhaps her most compelling power lies in this profound and magical ability, the capacity not just to represent youth, but to actively restore it. This concept of rejuvenation elevates her from a symbol to an active, miraculous force in the mythological landscape. While the nectar she served maintained the god's eternal prime, legends and allusions suggest her influence could reach into the mortal realm, performing the one miracle humanity desired above all others, reversing the relentless flow of time. This wasn't merely about staying young, it was about the impossible dream of becoming young again, of having the burdens of age physically lifted away. Think of the deep, universal longing in that idea. In a world without modern medicine, where a life of hard labor could leave a person worn out by 40, the fantasy of restored vitality wasn't just a frivolous wish, it was a desperate prayer for a second chance at life itself. Hebe embodied the answer to that prayer. We find one of the most poignant echoes of this power in the strange and beautiful myth of the sorceress Medea. In a gripping episode from the epic of the Argonauts, the heroes led by Jason arrive in the kingdom of the aged King Peleus, who has usurped the throne from Jason's father. The cunning Medea, seeking to help Jason reclaim his birthright, demonstrates a terrifying and awesome power to the king's own daughters. In a dramatic performance, she takes an old, worn-out ram, slaughters it, and throws its body into a cauldron filled with a magical potion she has brewed. To the daughters' astonishment, a young, vigorous lamb leaps forth from the pot, restored to the prime of its life. She convinces them that she can perform the same miracle on their elderly father, promising to return him to the strength and vigor of his youth. Tragically, the potion she provides them is a fake, and their attempt to rejuvenate Peleus ends in his gruesome death. Now, while Medea is the direct agent here, the magic she claims to wield is explicitly connected to the arts of Hebe. Ancient sources, including the poet Pindar, state that Medea learned these secrets of rejuvenation from the goddess Hebe herself, or at least that the potion was meant to mimic Hebe's divine power. This indirect link is incredibly revealing. It shows that the Greeks believed the capability for such a transformation existed within the divine order, and that Hebe was its ultimate source. She was the keeper of the recipe, as it were, for turning back the clock. The myth uses this terrifying demonstration to explore the dark side of the desire for youth, the danger, the deception, and the potential for it to become a fatal obsession. But at its core, it confirms that the power itself was real, and its origin was traced back to the gentle goddess of youth. Beyond this specific myth, the very artifacts associated with Hebe hint at this rejuvenating function. Her omnipresent pitcher, the ornicho from which she poured nectar, can be viewed as far more than a simple serving vessel. In the imagination of the ancient world, it becomes a direct parallel to the legendary fountain of youth, a concept that would captivate later cultures. The nectar that flowed from it wasn't just a divine beverage, it was a liquid manifestation of life force. If a single cup could sustain a god's immortality for another day, what might a full draught, administered directly by the goddess, do for a mortal? While there are no major surviving myths where Hebe personally steps down from Olympus to grant a mortal eternal youth, the implication is powerfully present in her iconography and her domain. The pitcher is the fountain, the act of pouring is the act of granting renewal. This symbolic connection transforms her from a passive figure into an active wellspring of potential transformation. It suggests that her grace wasn't limited to the Olympian feasts. It was a latent, accessible power in the world, a divine promise that the decay of age was not an absolute, unchangeable law of nature, but a condition that could, under the right circumstances, be miraculously suspended. This belief in a tangible, attainable rejuvenation speaks volumes about the Greek relationship with time and mortality. Their mythology is filled with stories that betray a deep anxiety about aging. Look at the fate of Tithonus, the Trojan prince loved by the dawn goddess Eos. She begged Zeus to grant him immortality, but forgot to ask for eternal youth. The result was a horrifying tragedy. Tithonus lived forever, but he continued to age indefinitely, eventually shrinking into a withered, chattering husk, locked in an endless, frail existence. This story serves as a grim warning about the incompleteness of mere immortality without the preserving quality of youth. It highlights the Greek understanding that life without vitality, without strength and beauty, was a curse, not a blessing. Hebe's power represented the missing piece that would make eternal life desirable. she was the solution to the problem of tithoness. The desperate desire for what she offered wasn't about vanity in the modern sense, it was about the essential quality of life itself. To be old in the ancient world often meant to be weak, dependent, and without honor or purpose. To be restored to youth was to be restored to one's place in society, to strength, to capability, to life itself. Hebe, therefore, stood at the very center of this profound cultural conflict, the heartbreaking human struggle against the inevitable fading of our own power and significance. Her mythical ability to reverse aging was the ultimate expression of a hope that the most universal and unstoppable force in our lives, time, could somehow be conquered. Yet for all her significance as an ideal, finding the physical footprints of Hebe's worship requires a more delicate kind of archaeology than for deities like Zeus or Athena. Unlike those major gods with their colossal temples dominating city centers, Hebe's sacred spaces were often more intimate, woven into the fabric of daily life and family rituals. The historical evidence pieced together from ancient writers, scattered inscriptions, and the remnants of small shrines paints a picture of a goddess whose veneration was personal and deeply connected to the most fundamental human hopes. One of the most significant centers of her worship was the city of Phlius in the northeastern Peloponnese. The travel writer Pausanias, our invaluable guide to ancient Greek religion, recorded that Phlius possessed a sacred grove dedicated to Hebe, and within it, a statue of the goddess crafted from gold and ivory, a lavish material typically reserved for the most important deities. This tells us that in certain localities, her cult was not a minor footnote but held considerable prestige and wealth. The choice of a grove is also revealing. Unlike a towering temple, a grove is a natural, living space, an enclosure of trees that evokes freshness, growth, and vitality, the very essence of Hebe's domain. Worshippers entering such a space would have been immersed in an environment that physically reflected her power, a quiet, shaded haven dedicated to the principle of everlasting spring. Beyond Phlius, evidence points to her worship in the great pan-Hellenic sanctuaries, though often in a supporting role that underscores her familial connections. At Argos, a major center of worship for her mother Hera, Hebe was venerated alongside the queen of the gods. This makes perfect sense within the framework of Hera's domain over the family life cycle. A worshipper praying to Hera for a successful marriage might also make an offering to her daughter Hebe, hoping for the resulting children to be blessed with health and a vigorous youth. Similarly, in the city of Mantinea, there are accounts of a temple where Hebe was worshipped under the specific title, Hebe the Bride. This epithet directly links her to that crucial transition for young women, connecting her power of youth to the moment of marriage. Here, she wasn't just an abstract concept, she was a divine patron for brides, a figure who could be called upon to ensure the bride entered her new life with the bloom of youth and the fertility that was expected to follow. Young women on the verge of marriage would have been among her most fervent supplicants, leaving offerings in the hope of carrying Hebe's blessing into their new households. So what form did these offerings take? While we lack detailed ritual texts specifically for Hebe, we can make educated guesses based on common practices for deities associated with life stages and the household. Votive offerings, gifts left for the goddess, would likely have been symbolic of the blessings requested. A family grateful for the healthy growth of their children might dedicate a small statue of a young boy or girl at her shrine. A lock of hair, a common offering for adolescents transitioning into adulthood, would be a profoundly fitting gift for the goddess of youth, symbolizing the leaving behind of one phase of life under her protection and the hopeful beginning of another. Given her role as cupbearer, libations, the pouring out of wine, milk, or honey would have been a particularly resonant act. Imagine a family gathering at a small altar in their own home, pouring out a little honeyed wine as they whispered a prayer to Hebe, asking her to watch over their son as he left for his military training as an epheb, or for their daughter as she approached marriage. These were not grand, state-sponsored sacrifices of oxen, but quiet, personal transactions of faith. Food offerings might include the first fruits of the season, symbols of fresh, new life, or cakes shaped into simple forms. The people who sought her blessings most fervently were those whose lives were directly touched by the fragile, precious nature of youth itself. Parents praying for the survival and vitality of their children, young athletes seeking a competitive edge, and perhaps most poignantly, the elderly who might have prayed not for their own rejuvenation, but for the health of the younger generation, carried their legacy forward. In the end, the scattered evidence of Hebe's cult shows a goddess who was met not with thunderous applause in vast amphitheaters, but with the quiet, hopeful whispers of ordinary people in sacred groves and at household altars, all asking for a touch of her divine grace on the most fleeting and treasured part of life. Crossing from the sun-drenched peaks of Greek Olympus to the 7 hills of Rome, we find that the story of the goddess of youth was far from over. In the rich tapestry of Roman state religion, Hebe was adopted and adapted, becoming known as Juventus, a name that directly translates to youth in Latin, much like her Greek counterpart. This wasn't a simple case of rebranding, it was a profound cultural translation. While the Greeks tended to personify abstract concepts as individual deities with rich personal myths, the Romans often viewed their gods more as numinous powers, divine forces that presided over specific aspects of civic and family life. Juventus was one such force, but her role became even more tightly interwoven with the very machinery of the Roman state and its most critical institution, the family. Her essence remained the same. She was the divine embodiment of the youthful prime, but her function evolved to serve the specific ideologies and ambitions of the Roman people, reflecting their deep-seated reverence for tradition, male citizenship, and the future of the Republic, and later the Empire. The Romans, ever pragmatic in their religious borrowings, saw in Hebe a divine concept that aligned perfectly with their own values. They recognized her as the goddess of youthful vigor, but they channeled that power toward a distinctly Roman purpose. Where Hebe's narrative in Greece was filled with familial relationships and personal myths, Juventus's story in Rome is less about her own biography and more about her official public role. She became a state goddess, a guardian of the Euvines, the young men who were the future soldiers, senators, and fathers of Rome. Her power was invoked to ensure that the next generation of Roman citizens would be strong, vital, and ready to assume the mantle of leadership and defense. This shift in emphasis from a personal, mythological figure to a public, civic deity is a hallmark of the Roman religious mindset. The Romans weren't as interested in whether Juventus had a brother like Ares or a husband like Heracles. They were intensely interested in whether her divine favor would guarantee the health and strength of their sons. Her temple in Rome, located within the sacred boundary of the city, wasn't just a place for private prayer, it was a state-sponsored institution, a physical declaration that the vitality of Roman youth was a matter of national security and divine concern. Perhaps the most significant and fascinating aspect of Juventus's worship was her central role in one of the most important rites of passage in a young Roman man's life, the Liberalia festival. This celebration, held on the 17th of March in honor of the god Liber Pater, a deity of fertility and freedom, marked the official transition of a boy into manhood and full citizenship. On this day, a young Roman, typically around the age of 14 to 16, would publicly set aside his toga praetexta, the striped toga of childhood, and don the pure white toga virilis, the toga of manhood. This was not a private family affair, it was a public ceremony witnessed by the community, a ritual that formally introduced him to the political and social body of Rome. And at the very heart of this transformation was an offering to Juventus. After processing to the forum with his family and friends, the young man would make a sacrifice, often a coin, at the temple of Juventus. This act was profoundly symbolic. It was a payment of sorts, a transactional exchange with the goddess of youth. By making this offering, he wasn't asking to remain a boy. he was formally thanking her for her protection during his childhood and asking for her continued blessing as he carried the vigor of youth into his new responsibilities as a man. He was effectively consecrating his youthful strength to the service of the state. This ritual beautifully illustrates the Roman conception of life stages. Childhood was under the protection of Juventus, a time to grow and develop that vital strength. Adulthood was not an abandonment of that strength, but its application. The offering at her temple was a symbolic handover, a way of saying, "The youth you granted me is now ready to be used for Rome." It cemented the idea that a citizen's physical prime was not a personal asset but a public resource. For the family, this was a day of immense pride and solemnity. Their son was now a man in the eyes of the law, capable of inheriting property, voting in the assemblies, and serving in the legions. The blessing of Juventus was considered essential for this transition to be successful, ensuring that the young man would not only be legally an adult, but would also be physically and morally equipped to bear the weight of that new status. The Liberalia, with its offering to Juventus, was therefore a cornerstone of Roman societal continuity, a repetitive, generation-spanning ritual that constantly replenished the citizen body with vigorous, divinely sanctioned new members. Juventus's influence, however, extended beyond this single annual ceremony. Her presence was felt in other critical areas of Roman life, particularly within the sprawling, powerful institution of the equites, or the equestrian order. This was the class of wealthy citizens who served as cavalry officers, tax collectors, and businessmen, the economic and military backbone of the Roman state. They maintained their own distinct identity and pride, and they too looked to Juventus as their patron. A special cult of Juventus was maintained by the equestrians, and there are records of games or ludi being held in her honor, funded by this influential order. This connection makes perfect sense. The equites, as cavalry, relied on the speed, agility, and physical prowess of young men and their horses. Juventus, as the goddess of that very vitality, was a natural patron for their endeavors. By honoring her, they were not only seeking her blessing for their individual members, but were also symbolically linking the vigor of their order to the health of the state itself. It was another way in which the abstract concept of youth was politicized and put into service for Rome's glory. When we step back and compare the two goddesses, Hebe and Juventus, the contrasts reveal the unique characters of their respective cultures. The Greek Hebe is a figure of myth and beauty. We know her as a daughter, a sister, a wife. We see her tripping in a moment of humanizing clumsiness, serving nectar to her divine family and marrying the great hero Heracles. Her story is personal, narrative, and rich with the complexities of family dynamics on Olympus. The Roman Juventus, by contrast, is a figure of function and statecraft. Her mythology is sparse, her power is what matters. She is less a character in a story and more a divine office, a force that presides over the critical transition of young men into citizen soldiers. The Greek focus was on the ideal of youth as a beautiful, fleeting state, something to be admired and yearned for. The Roman focus was on youth as a practical resource, a reservoir of strength to be harnessed for the expansion and maintenance of an empire. This isn't to say that the Romans were devoid of poetry in their reverence. The act of a young man offering his first coin to Juventus was deeply poignant. But the poesy was always in service to the state. The legacy of Juventus demonstrates how a divine concept can be reshaped to fit the soul of a nation, transforming the graceful cupbearer of mythical feasts into a cornerstone of civic duty and imperial ambition. This brings us to a dimension of Hebe that transcends the marble of ancient temples and reaches directly into the architecture of our own minds. If we view mythology not just as a collection of entertaining stories, but as a profound language for the human psyche, then Hebe transforms from a distant goddess into a powerful, living archetype. In the framework of thinkers like Carl Jung, an archetype is a universal, primal pattern of behavior and perception that resides in our collective unconscious. These are the fundamental roles and energies that appear across all cultures and all times, and Hebe perfectly embodies what is often called the maiden or the eternal youth archetype. This isn't merely about being physically young, it's an internal state of being, a specific energy that influences how we approach the world. The maiden represents curiosity, openness, potential, and the pure, uncommitted spirit that exists before life's responsibilities and hardships carve deep grooves into our identity. She is that part of us that is forever at the beginning, forever believing in new possibilities, and forever capable of wonder. When we feel a surge of excitement at starting a new project, the giddy nervousness of a first date, or the simple joy of learning something completely novel, we are, in that moment, touched by the energy of the Hebe archetype. She is the incarnation of life's springtime, not as a season we leave behind, but as a perpetual inner landscape we can always return to. However, like all profound archetypes, this energy has both a luminous side and a potential shadow. In its healthy, balanced expression, the Hebe archetype infuses our lives with vitality and resilience. It's the force that allows us to recover from setbacks with a sense of beginner's mind, to approach challenges with fresh eyes rather than jaded cynicism. Think of an artist who, even after decades, still feels that thrilling tremor of possibility before a blank canvas, or a scientist who retains a childlike curiosity about the universe, constantly asking, "What if?" And why? This is Hebe's gift, the ability to remain psychologically flexible, adaptable, and open to experience. It protects us from the spiritual rigidity that can set in with age, where we believe we have seen it all and learned all there is to know. A person with a well-integrated Hebe energy carries a certain lightness of being. They can be serious without being somber, experienced without being world-weary. They understand that wisdom isn't about accumulating final answers, but about nurturing a perpetual state of learning and growth. This is why we are instinctively drawn to people who seem young at heart. They haven't lost their connection to this vital, renewing archetypal force. Yet, when this archetype becomes stuck or dominant to the exclusion of others, it manifests as its shadow, the perpetual adolescent. This is the darker side of eternal youth, a refusal to grow up, an avoidance of commitment, and a flight from the necessary burdens of adulthood. The shadow Hebe is the person who, well into their 30s or 40s, remains financially and emotionally dependent, bouncing from one entry-level job or relationship to another without ever planting deep roots. They may cling to a teenage aesthetic or lifestyle long past its natural expiration date, not out of genuine joy, but out of a deep-seated fear of the responsibilities, limitations, and complexities that come with maturity. In psychological terms, this is a failure to integrate the other essential archetypes, like the responsible sovereign or the nurturing parent. The modern phenomenon of failure to launch, or the cultural celebration of extended adolescence in certain contexts, can be seen as a collective expression of the Hebe archetype running in its shadow form. It's the pursuit of youth not as a state of spirit, but as an escape from the demands of the full human journey. This archetypal understanding gives us a powerful lens through which to view our own modern quest for youth. Our culture is saturated with Hebe's imagery, from the multi-billion-dollar anti-aging industry promising to erase wrinkles, to the glorification of youthful influencers and the constant pressure to remain relevant and cool. On one level, this can be seen as a massive, collective acting out of the Hebe archetype, a societal obsession with the maiden's domain. But is this a healthy worship or a desperate shadow? When the pursuit of physical youth becomes an anxious attempt to outwardly mimic the Hebe archetype while inwardly avoiding the growth she is meant to precede, we fall into the trap. True Hebe energy isn't about looking 20 when you are 50. It's about carrying the curiosity, vitality, and openness of 20 into the wisdom of 50. The modern challenge, then, is not to reject this archetype but to integrate it consciously. It's about learning to honor the maiden within without letting her run the entire show. This means allowing ourselves to be playful and spontaneous while also building a stable, responsible life. It means embracing new technology and ideas without discarding the hard-won lessons of experience. It's the balance between the youthful flexibility of Hebe and the mature structure of Hera, the queen. Ultimately, the journey of Hebe as an archetype is a journey of integration, and her own myth provides the map. Her story does not end with her as the eternal cupbearer. She grows, she transitions, she marries, and she steps into a new role. This is the key psychological insight. The goal is not to remain a perpetual maiden, serving the needs of others from a place of innocent dependency. The goal is to take that innate youthful vitality and pour it into our own sacred partnerships, our creative endeavors, and our life's purpose, just as Hebe poured her nectar for Heracles, focusing her power of renewal on a chosen, meaningful commitment. The archetype calls us to bring our beginner's mind to our deepest relationships, to approach our work with fresh enthusiasm each day, and to see the world with a sense of wonder that no amount of hardship can completely extinguish. Hebe reminds us that youth is not a date on a calendar, but a quality of the soul. It is the ever-present potential for renewal that exists within us all, the inner fountain that allows us to meet each new chapter of life not with weariness, but with the hopeful, vibrant heart of the maiden eternally reborn. Yet, even as we trace the footprints of her worship, a different kind of evidence for her enduring power emerges from the pages of ancient texts where poets gave her a life beyond the altar. From the very dawn of Western literature, Hebe appears not just as a mythological figure, but as a potent literary symbol, her image wielded by poets to evoke a complex blend of beauty, vitality, and a very specific kind of feminine grace. Our earliest glimpses of her come from the epic works of Homer and Hesiod, where she is firmly established within the divine hierarchy. In the Iliad, she is a presence in the background of Olympus, one of the daughters of Zeus who prepares a bath for the war-weary Ares, a moment that quietly underscores her role in restoring the gods. But it is in the Odyssey where we get a more vivid picture. Homer describes her as the one who draws the nectar for the gods, a simple, functional statement that nonetheless carries immense weight. In the economy of Homeric epic, where every detail serves to reinforce the cosmic order, this isn't a minor chore, it is the definition of her place. She is the necessary agent of the gods' perpetual feast, a symbol of the unending celebration and power that defines their existence compared to the mortal struggle of the heroes below. Hesiod, in his Theogony, goes a step further, solidifying her lineage and her essential nature. He names her explicitly as the daughter of Hera, a glorious child, and in doing so, he anchors her not just in a family tree, but in a specific domain of influence. These early references are sparse, almost matter-of-fact, but they are foundational. They establish Hebe as an integral, functioning part of the divine machinery, her beauty and youth presented as inherent qualities of her office, the natural attributes of the one who serves the immortal council. She is not yet a deeply explored character, but she is an indispensable piece of the poetic backdrop, a shimmering thread in the tapestry of the cosmos as the Greeks understood it. As we move forward from the epic age into the rich world of lyric poetry, the depiction of Hebe begins to acquire new shades of meaning, particularly in the hands of poets like Pindar. In his victory odes, written to celebrate the triumphs of athletes at the great Panhellenic Games, Hebe's symbolism becomes more focused and personally resonant. For Pindar, a victor's achievement was a momentary touch of the divine, a fleeting instance where a mortal could embody the excellence of the gods. In this context, Hebe becomes the ultimate metaphor for the prize these young men sought. Their victory was a taste of her power, a momentary state of supreme, godlike vitality and perfection. In his Nemean odes, Pindar explicitly links the victor's glory to Hebe, describing how the winner is crowned and celebrated, his body a testament to the youthful vigor she personifies. But Pindar also introduces a more nuanced and somewhat troubling aspect of her myth. In one of his works, he refers to Hebe being stripped of her divine functions by the wrath of her mother, Hera. This fleeting mention hints at a tradition where Hebe's stumble was not a simple accident, but a transgression that led to her being formally removed from her post. This version adds a layer of pathos and fallibility to her character. It suggests that even the embodiment of flawless youth could be subject to divine displeasure and could lose her position, a powerful reminder of the instability of fortune even for the gods. Pindar uses this not to delve deeply into Hebe's psychology, but to serve his greater theme, that glory, like youth itself, is breathtaking but precarious. The athlete's peak moment is as fragile as Hebe's grace, and both can be lost in an instant. This poetic use transforms her from a static symbol into a dynamic lesson about the nature of success and the favor of the gods. Throughout the classical period and into the Hellenistic age, Hebe's primary literary function solidified around the idealized, passive, and beautiful maiden. In the works of playwrights and poets, she is consistently the epitome of Parthenos, the unwed girl whose value lies in her purity, her grace, and her service to the patriarchal order of Olympus. She is the standard against which mortal female beauty is measured. A woman might be described as Hebe-like to signify that she possessed a fresh, youthful, and modest attractiveness. This literary shorthand reveals a great deal about ancient Greek gender ideals. The perfect young woman was envisioned not as a powerful actor in her own right, but as a serene, beautiful, and dutiful presence. Hebe's most famous action, pouring nectar, is the archetype of this acceptable feminine role, a graceful, self-effacing act of service that sustains the powerful men around her without challenging their authority. She is never the subject of her own epic. She is a beautiful object in the epics of others. This portrayal was not necessarily seen as negative by the ancient audience. It was the ideal. Her passivity was her virtue. Her beauty was a decoration for the divine court. Her entire literary presence in this context reinforces a social structure where the most celebrated form of female power was the quiet, supportive power that enabled male action and authority. She is the divine correlate of the well-bred Athenian maiden, whose greatest honor was to marry well and bear citizen sons, her own identity seamlessly absorbed into the legacy of her husband and father. This established literary image makes the radical revisions of later poets all the more striking. Fast forward to the 19th century, and we find the Romantic and Victorian poets seizing upon the figure of Hebe, but they often imbue her with a new, almost subversive energy that reflects their own cultural preoccupations. John Keats, in his lush and sensuous poetry, frequently invokes Hebe not just as a symbol of youth, but as an embodiment of intense, almost intoxicating sensual pleasure. For Keats, her nectar isn't just the fuel of immortality. It is the very essence of poetic inspiration and ecstatic experience. In his poetry, to drink from Hebe's cup is to taste the sublime, to be transported by beauty itself. This transforms her from a passive server into an active muse of sensory delight. Even more dramatically, the Victorian poet Robert Browning, in his dramatic monologue Fifine at the Fair, completely reimagines her stumble. In Browning's version, Hebe's fall is not a moment of clumsiness or disgrace, but a deliberate, rebellious act. He has his speaker proclaim that she spilt the nectar cup, flung the ambrosia, and so laughing from the presence of the high and mighty gods departed. This is a breathtaking reinterpretation. Browning's Hebe is no passive maiden. She is a figure of agency who actively rejects her servile role. She flings the sacred substances, laughs in the face of divine authority, and proudly walks away. This Hebe is a proto-feminist icon, a symbol of throwing off the constraints of a predetermined, subservient life. Browning, writing in an age of increasing social change and questioning of traditional roles, uses the ancient myth to explore themes of independence and self-determination. His version asks us to consider whether the grace of service is truly a virtue, or if it might be a gilded cage from which the soul must sometimes break free, even at the cost of divine displeasure. This journey through literature, from Homer's functional cupbearer to Browning's rebellious goddess, shows us that Hebe has always been more than just a name on a list of Olympians. She has been a flexible and enduring symbol, a blank canvas upon which every generation of writers has painted its own ideals and anxieties about youth, beauty, and the role of women. The ancient poets used her to codify a social ideal of passive, serving femininity, making her a cornerstone of the divine order. The later poets, unbound by the same cultural constraints, saw in her the potential for a different story, one of sensual power or defiant liberation. Her literary legacy is a testament to the power of myth to evolve, to speak to the concerns of the present while retaining the echo of its ancient past. When a modern reader encounters Hebe in a poem or a novel, they are engaging with this entire rich tapestry, a conversation across millennia about what it means to be young, to be beautiful, and to find one's own power, whether through graceful service or through the courageous decision to spill the cup and walk away. Now consider a different side of Hebe, one that isn't explicitly written in the myths but is whispered between the lines of her very nature. In a pantheon ruled by thunderbolts, fraught with betrayals, and steeped in eternal grudges where Hera's wrath could span generations, and the Furies pursued vengeance without rest, what place was there for simple forgiveness? This is where Hebe's essence as the embodiment of pure, untarnished youth might reveal a profound, overlooked dimension of her power. Youth in its ideal state is not just about physical vitality. It is also about a psychological and spiritual openness. A child, before the world hardens them, does not hold grudges with the same ferocity as an adult. They live in the present, their emotional slate wiped clean with each new sunrise. Hebe, as the divine personification of this state, could therefore be seen as a living embodiment of this capacity for renewal on an emotional and moral level. She represents the possibility of starting over, not just physically but in the heart. Think of the symbolic weight of her most sacred act, serving the nectar of renewal. Every day she offered the gods a cup that wiped away any weariness, any lingering drain on their divine essence. This was a daily ritual of cleansing, a literal and metaphorical refreshment. If we extend this symbolism, her act can be interpreted as a form of divine grace, a gentle, ongoing absolution that allowed the gods to continue their eternal existence unburdened by the spiritual fatigue of their own endless dramas and conflicts. She wasn't just replenishing their immortality, she was, in a subtle way, facilitating a constant state of pardon, enabling the Olympians to move forward from their quarrels without the mortal weight of permanent resentment. This interpretive lens casts her famous marriage to Heracles in a completely new and startling light. Remember, Heracles was the living symbol of Hera's most profound and enduring hatred. He was the son of her husband's infidelity, and she hounded him relentlessly throughout his mortal life, driving him to madness and imposing the 12 nearly impossible labors. Their relationship was the very definition of an irreconcilable feud. Yet, the resolution to this epic conflict was not a battle or a decree from Zeus. It was a marriage, the union of Hera's own daughter, Hebe, with her greatest enemy. This isn't just a political arrangement, it's a cosmic act of reconciliation so profound it's difficult to overstate. By giving Hebe to Heracles, Hera wasn't merely accepting him onto Olympus, she was integrating him into her own family through the most intimate bond possible. And Hebe, as the agent of this union, becomes the divine instrument of forgiveness. Her very presence, her innate innocence and youth, becomes the balm that heals the most festering wound in the Olympian family. She doesn't argue or negotiate, she simply is. Her nature as the fresh start, the new beginning, makes her the perfect vehicle to end an ancient grudge. In marrying Hebe, Heracles gains more than immortality. He receives the ultimate pardon from the house that persecuted him. The goddess of youth becomes the goddess of reconciliation, her union silently declaring that even the most bitter chapters can end and that the future can be cleansed of the past's poison. We can even look back at her daily interactions in the Great Hall for evidence of this gentle influence. Imagine the scene after a furious argument between Zeus and Hera, or following Ares' bloody return from a conflict he perhaps instigated. The atmosphere would be thick with divine tension, a palpable aura of anger and wounded pride. Then Hebe enters. She moves with a serene grace that is the very antithesis of conflict. She offers the cup, not taking sides, not casting judgment, but simply performing her duty with a quiet neutrality. In that moment, the act of accepting the cup from her hand becomes a silent agreement to pause the hostility, to partake in a shared ritual of renewal. It's a celestial timeout, enforced not by authority but by grace. Her innocence creates a temporary sanctuary from the scheming and the thunder. The gods, in their weariness or in their momentary reflection while drinking, might find their anger cooling, their perspective shifting, simply by being in the presence of such unspoiled purity. She doesn't preach forgiveness. She embodies the state of being in which forgiveness is possible, a state free from the corrupting memories of old grievances. In a world of epic egos, her quiet, non-threatening presence may have been one of the only forces capable of softening hearts without a word being spoken. This concept of Hebe as a figure of forgiveness also invites a fascinating comparison with other deities who dealt in clemency and mercy, or rather, the stark lack of them. Look at the Erinyes, the Furies, whose entire existence was dedicated to pursuing and punishing transgressions, especially those within the family. They were the embodiment of unforgiving vengeance, the ancient laws of blood guilt made manifest. Hebe exists at the opposite end of this spectrum. Where the Erinyes demanded endless retribution for past sins, Hebe offered the possibility of a clean slate. Another telling contrast is with Nemesis, the goddess of retribution and indignation against hubris. She ensured that no one stepped too far out of line without facing consequences. Again, Hebe's domain is not about consequences for the past, but about potential for the future. She doesn't deal in the balancing of scales, but in their resetting. Even among the more forgiving gods, the concept was often conditional. Athena could be placated, Zeus could be persuaded, but their mercy was a decision, an act of will. Hebe's forgiveness is different. It's not something she actively grants, but a quality that radiates from her very being. It is an atmospheric influence, a passive power that makes reconciliation possible simply because she represents a world where old wounds do not have to define the present. She is the divine equivalent of the morning after a storm, when the air is washed clean and everything feels new again, offering the chance to try once more without the burden of yesterday's failures. In the harsh, justice-obsessed world of Greek myth, Hebe stands as a quiet testament to a different, gentler power. The revolutionary idea that sometimes the strongest force is not the memory of a wrong, but the capacity to begin again. This idea of renewal and cleansing leads us to a deeper, more subtle aspect of Hebe's power, one that connects her eternal youth to the ancient Greek world's profound concern with ritual purity. In the mindset of the ancient Greeks, to be pure hagnos wasn't just about physical cleanliness. It was a state of spiritual readiness, a condition of being free from pollution or miasma that allowed one to safely approach the divine. Miasma could come from many sources: contact with death, childbirth, certain acts of violence, or even just the mundane impurities of daily life. This state of pollution wasn't considered a moral sin in a Judeo-Christian sense, but rather a tangible, almost contagious stain that disrupted the proper order between humans and gods and had to be ceremonially washed away before participating in any sacred rite. Now consider the inherent qualities of youth as personified by Hebe. a young person, especially a maiden or an unwed youth, was often seen as naturally closer to a state of purity. They were untainted by the full weight of adult life, the blood of battle, the complexities of sexual relations, the profound pollutions associated with death and childbirth. Their very being represented a kind of pristine starting point, a clean slate. Hebe, as the divine embodiment of this life stage, can therefore be understood as the ultimate expression of ritual purity. Her domain wasn't just about the vitality of the body, but about that pristine, preparatory state of the soul that was required for all sacred beginnings. We can see this connection manifest in the specific rituals that marked a young person's life, where physical transition and spiritual cleansing were inextricably linked. Take, for example, the rituals for a young Athenian girl on the verge of marriage. Before her wedding, she would perform the ritual of the Lautrophoros, fetching water from a sacred spring to bathe herself. This was not a simple bath, it was a ceremonial act of purification, washing away her identity as a Parthenos, a maiden, and preparing her sacred body for its new role as a wife and mother. The water itself was a cleansing agent, but the act was performed under the auspices of her transition out of the state of youth, the very state over which Hebe presided. Similarly, a young man preparing for his induction as an epheb, a citizen soldier, would undergo purification rites. He was leaving the relative purity of the boy's world and entering the polluted, violent world of men and warfare. The rituals cleansed him for this new, heavy responsibility. In both cases, the transition from one stage of youth to another, or from youth to adulthood, was sanctified by an act of ritual washing. Hebe, as the goddess of that entire youthful phase, was the divine backdrop against which these purifications took place. Her presence in the cultural imagination legitimized the idea that youth was the ideal raw material, the pure state that had to be carefully prepared and consecrated before it could be responsibly used by the family and the city. She was the guardian of that precious, unpolluted potential. This symbolic link between youth and purity finds a powerful echo in Hebe's own most famous duty, the serving of nectar. Think of the scene in the divine hall. The gods, though immortal, were not immune to the spiritual wear and tear of their own conflicts and interventions in the mortal world. When they assembled for their feast, they were engaging in a sacred, communal act that reinforced their divine order. Hebe's role in this ritual was absolutely central. By offering them the cup of nectar, she wasn't just giving them a drink, she was facilitating their own divine purification. Each sip was a renewal of their essence, a ceremonial cleansing that washed away any lingering spiritual fatigue or miasma they may have accumulated. She was, in effect, the divine officiant of their own perpetual state of ritual readiness. This transforms her from a simple servant into a kind of high priestess of Olympus. Her grace and purity were the necessary conditions that made the entire ritual effective. In the same way that a mortal priest had to be ritually clean to handle sacrificial offerings, Hebe, in her eternal, unstained youth, was the only being fit to handle and distribute the very substance of the god's immortality. Her personal purity guaranteed the efficacy of the ritual for everyone else. This interpretation also casts her eventual replacement by Ganymede in a fascinating new light. If Hebe represents an inherent birthright purity, the natural, untarnished state of the royal daughter, then Ganymede represents a purity that is bestowed or recognized. He is a mortal and thus inherently more susceptible to pollution, who is chosen and elevated to a state of purity sufficient for the role. His appointment suggests that the required purity for the cupbearer was not an unchangeable, innate quality, but one that could be granted by the king of the gods himself. This distinction mirrors the two ways purity was understood in the human realm. There was the natural purity of the child, and there was the ritual purity that could be achieved through ceremony and sanctification by an authority. Hebe embodies the first, while Ganymede's story illustrates the second. Both are valid paths to the same sacred goal, but they start from fundamentally different places. Hebe's connection to this concept of inherent ritual cleanliness makes her a far more foundational and serious figure than her gentle demeanor might suggest. She wasn't just a pretty face serving drinks. She was the living, breathing guarantee that the highest rituals of the cosmos were performed in a state of perfect grace, ensuring that the machinery of divinity remained untarnished and effective for all eternity. While she may not be a household name like Zeus or Athena, the spirit of Hebe, the quintessential ideal of youth and renewal, has quietly permeated the landscape of modern pop culture, often in ways we might not immediately recognize. Her influence is less about direct portrayal and more about the powerful, marketable concept she represents. We see her legacy not in blockbuster films where she appears as a character, but in the very industries and narratives that sell us the dream of eternal youth and vibrant vitality. Think about the massive market for anti-aging creams, energy drinks, and wellness supplements. These are all, in a sense, secular prayers to Hebe. They are our modern-day ambrosia and nectar, the potions we consume in the hope of recapturing or preserving that fleeting state of prime she so perfectly embodies. A brand like Red Bull, with its slogan, "Red Bull gives you wings," is directly selling a form of Hebe's power, a liquid boost that restores energy and vigor, a promise of renewed vitality in a can. The entire wellness and biohacking movements, with their focus on longevity and peak physical performance, are contemporary cults dedicated to the same principles Hebe presided over. We may not build temples to her anymore, but we spend billions at the altar of the ideals she represents. Venture into the world of video games, and you'll find her archetype woven into the very fabric of character classes and magical systems. While you might not encounter a character explicitly named Hebe, her domain is everywhere. Consider the ubiquitous white mage or cleric class in countless role-playing games, from the Final Fantasy series to World of Warcraft. These characters are the party's lifeline, the ones who cast healing spells, remove debilitating status effects like poison or slow, and resurrect fallen comrades. This is a direct digital translation of Hebe's rejuvenating power. She isn't dealing damage, she is restoring it, mending the party and ensuring its continued vitality, just as Hebe sustained the gods. In games like Hades, the core loop is built around the concept of dying and being reborn stronger, a cycle of renewal that is literally fueled by sipping from a nectar item which grants you a permanent power-up. The game makes the metaphor explicit, directly linking the consumable that makes you stronger to the divine substance Hebe served. Other games feature fountains of youth as key locations, magical springs that fully restore a character's health and mana. These in-game landmarks are modern mythological constructs, and they all draw from the same symbolic well as Hebe's ever-flowing picture. The literary world, particularly the booming genre of young adult fantasy and modern myth retellings, has also found a natural place for Hebe's essence. Rick Riordan's immensely popular Percy Jackson and the Olympian series, and its subsequent spin-offs, bring the Greek gods into the modern age. While Hebe hasn't taken a central stage as a major character, she is present in the background, acknowledged as part of the divine roster. Her very inclusion in this modern pantheon introduces her to a new generation, framing her as a living, relevant deity whose power of youth continues to operate in the 21st century. More abstractly, the entire chosen one trope so common in your fiction often hinges on a young protagonist discovering their hidden power. This narrative arc is a celebration of the Hebe archetype, the unlocking of latent potential, the blooming of power during the adolescent years. The story isn't about an already powerful adult, but about the journey of youth itself becoming a formidable force. Furthermore, authors who reimagine mythology often explore the more personal sides of these ancient figures. A novel might delve into Hebe's perspective on her marriage to Heracles, or her feelings about being replaced by Ganymede, giving a voice to the traditionally silent, graceful maiden and exploring the complexities of her seemingly perfect existence. Perhaps one of the most direct and fascinating uses of her name is in the commercial sphere. Hebe itself has been adopted as a brand name, most notably for a line of products in the home and garden sector. This is a brilliant, if unconscious, piece of mythological marketing. The name evokes a sense of freshness, nature, and blooming vitality, all core attributes of the goddess. When you buy a Hebe plant for your garden, you are, in a way, inviting a piece of her symbolic energy into your home. It's a testament to the enduring power of these ancient archetypes that a name from 2,000-year-old myths can still carry such a potent and positive connotation today. We see a similar, though more direct, borrowing in the name of the element, hafnium. While the scientific connection is tenuous, its name is derived from Hafnia, the Latin name for Copenhagen, which itself harkens back to a harbor, a place of new beginnings and journeys. This linguistic thread, however faint, connects back to a world where naming things after divine concepts was common practice. Our modern world is still dotted with these mythological ghosts, subtle reminders that the stories of the past continue to shape the language and symbols of our present. Ultimately, the relative scarcity of Hebe in the mainstream spotlight compared to gods of war or thunder is itself profoundly telling. It reflects our culture's complicated relationship with the very concept she represents. We are obsessed with youth, yet we often fail to honor its pure, gentle form. We prefer our power to be explosive and our stories to be centered on conflict. Hebe's enduring presence in the niches, in healing magic, in brand names, in the background of retold myths shows that her power is a quiet, sustaining one. She doesn't need a starring role in a summer blockbuster to be relevant. Her influence is felt in every product that promises renewal, in every story that champions the potential of the young, and in every human heart that yearns for a second wind, a fresh start, or a taste of the divine vitality that makes life worth living. She remains the eternal cupbearer, and in our modern world we are all still reaching for her cup. But what happens when the very blessing that defines you becomes an invisible, gilded cage? We've explored Hebe as the embodiment of a beautiful ideal, but it's time to contemplate a more somber possibility, the profound psychological burden that might have accompanied her eternal, unchanging state. Imagine being forever frozen at the starting line of life, celebrated for a potential you can never fulfill, and watching everyone else around you evolve while you remain precisely the same. The very concept of eternal youth, so alluring from the outside, could have been a hidden tragedy for the goddess herself, a sentence to perpetual immaturity in a cosmos where growth through experience was the only path to true power and respect. In the dynamic, often perilous world of Greek mythology, wisdom was not a gift given lightly. It was forged in the fires of hardship, loss, and the hard-won lessons of lived experience. Athena, the goddess of wisdom, was born from Zeus's head, yes, but her strategic brilliance was honed through eons of guiding heroes and navigating divine politics. Even Zeus grew from a usurping son into a measured, if flawed, ruler, but Hebe, her domain was the beautiful, static peak before the journey of life truly begins. She was the perfect daughter, the eternal maiden, a role that by its very definition prevented her from ascending to the more complex and authoritative roles of queen, mother, or wise counselor. She served the nectar that granted renewal to others, but what renewal was available for her own soul, locked as it was in an endless, flawless spring? This stagnation is thrown into sharp relief when we look at the other goddesses around her and the clear paths of transformation available to them. Artemis and Athena were also virgin goddesses, but they channeled that state into immense active power. Artemis became the fierce protector of the wild and the hunt, a leader of nymphs, a force of nature. Athena became the patron of heroic endeavor, statecraft, and weaving, her mind a weapon as sharp as any spear. Their choice to remain Parthenoi was a source of their strength and autonomy, defining their independent spheres of influence. For Hebe, however, youthfulness wasn't a chosen path to power. It was her entire, unchangeable identity. She didn't have a sphere of action like the hunt or wisdom. She had a state of being, and a state, unlike an action, offers no journey, no mastery, no evolution. Her mother Hera transitioned from bride to queen to a mother who, for all her flaws, wielded immense political and marital power. Demeter's story is one of profound grief and transformation through the loss of her daughter, a pain that gave her a deep, empathetic connection to all mortal suffering. Aphrodite, though often shallow, engaged in the messy, complex dramas of love and desire. Hebe, by contrast, seems trapped in a kind of divine arrested development. She is never the subject of a great quest, a tragic loss, or a moment of profound choice. Her most famous story is a stumble, an accident that leads to her replacement, a narrative not of her own agency but of something happening to her. In a world where the other gods accumulated rich, complicated histories, Hebe's story remains curiously thin, defined more by her function than her personhood. This lack of a narrative arc could be read as the ultimate cost of her blessing, the inability to have a story of her own at all. Consider the immense pressure of being the standard of perfection. For mere mortals, youth is a season of experimentation, of making mistakes, of stumbling and learning to get back up. It's a time for awkward phases, foolish choices, and the slow, sometimes painful, construction of an identity. Hebe was denied all of that. She had to be grace itself every single day, forever. There was no room for a bad day, for a moment of anger, for the sullenness of a teenager, or the uncertainty of a young adult. Her value was contingent on her flawless performance of a single, repetitive duty. The moment she allegedly stumbled, that perfection was shattered, and her role was given to another. This creates a terrifying paradox. To be the goddess of youth is to be forever judged by its most impossible ideal, without any of the human allowances for growth that make real youth such a vibrant, transformative time. Her existence was a performance, and the script never changed. We can only wonder if, in the quiet moments away from the feasting hall, the ever-smiling goddess ever felt the weight of that mask, yearning for the freedom to be something other than just young. This leads us to the poignant symbolism of her marriage to Heracles. On the surface, it's a triumphant conclusion for the hero and a political reconciliation for Olympus. But for Hebe, what did it truly mean? It was the one major transition permitted in her life, the moment she moved from daughter to wife. Yet, even this change can be viewed as a continuation of her static role, just in a new context. She was no longer serving all the gods. She was now the personal bestower of eternal youth for her husband. Her power remained focused on rejuvenation, on sustaining another. There is no great myth about Hebe and Heracles embarking on adventures together, or of her counsel shaping his decisions as a god. She becomes his divine support system, the beautiful, youthful wife ensuring the hero never wearies. It's a promotion in status, certainly, but does it represent an internal evolution for her, or is it simply a reassignment of her eternal, defining purpose from the many to the one? The marriage secures her place in the Olympian family, but it doesn't necessarily liberate her from the core constraint of her being. She is still, fundamentally, the embodiment of a quality rather than a complex being who has integrated that quality into a larger, more mature self. The true depth of this hidden tragedy is most powerfully understood by its inverse, the Greek horror of eternal aging without end. The myth of Tithonus serves as the perfect, chilling mirror to Hebe's plight. The Trojan prince was loved by the dawn goddess Eos, who begged Zeus to grant him immortality. Her wish was granted, but she made a catastrophic error. She forgot to ask for eternal youth to accompany it. The result was one of the most terrifying fates in all of mythology. Tithonus lived forever, but he continued to age. He grew increasingly frail, his body withering, his mind likely fading, until he was reduced to a helpless, babbling old man, eventually shriveling into a cicada, forever chirping with a voice that had lost all its strength. This story is a nightmare about the curse of existence without the vitality that makes existence worthwhile. Hebe's destiny is the opposite, but is it truly that much better? Tithonus is trapped in a body that has lost all its potential. Hebe is trapped in a body that can never realize its potential. Tithonus embodies the horror of endless decline. Hebe embodies the pathos of endless preparation. Both are denied the complete, organic human experience, which is a journey with a beginning, a middle, and an end. The Greeks understood that a life without change is not a life at all. It is a form of stasis, and in a universe governed by cycles of death and rebirth, stasis is a kind of living death. Hebe, forever blooming, is forever barred from the fruit that follows the flower. In the end, appreciating Hebe requires us to hold two contrasting truths in our minds at once. She is both the glorious ideal of everything we desire and a cautionary tale about the price of perfection. She represents our most fervent wish to stop time, to preserve our strength and beauty, to remain in that golden, untarnished moment at the peak of our powers. Yet her myth subtly warns us that a life without the scars of experience, without the wisdom of loss, and without the hard-earned growth that comes from overcoming our stumbles, might be a life only half-lived. Her eternal smile may have hidden a profound loneliness, the quiet sorrow of a goddess who could renew everyone but herself. She is a beautiful, bittersweet reminder that our mortality, with all its pain and inevitable conclusion, is also what gives our choices their weight, our loves their urgency, and our lives their unique, irreplaceable story. The true blessing may not be eternal youth, but the precious, fleeting opportunity to grow old. So why did the quiet hum of devotion at Hebe's altars eventually fade into silence, overshadowed by the thunderous cults of gods like Zeus or the dramatic mysteries of Demeter? The decline of her active worship wasn't a single event, but a slow cultural shift that reveals a great deal about the evolution of human priorities and what we ask of our gods in times of crisis and change. In the relatively stable and prosperous world of archaic and early classical Greece, the ideal of youthful beauty and vitality held a central, cherished place. City-states were focused on cultivating strong, beautiful citizens for their armies and healthy mothers for their future generations. Hebe, as the personification of this ideal, was a natural and essential figure. But as Greek history unfolded, marked by the brutal, decades-long Peloponnesian War, plagues, and increasing political instability, the collective psyche began to change. When your world is literally collapsing around you, when plague carts are a daily sight and survival is uncertain, prayers tend to become more desperate and immediate. The aspiration for perfect, flourishing youth begins to feel like a luxury, while the cries for deliverance, for powerful intervention, and for explanations of profound suffering rise to a crescendo. People turned away from the goddess of life's beautiful peak and towards deities who could answer the agonizing questions at its terrifying depths. This pivot towards gods of power and salvation is starkly visible in the rise of cults like that of Asclepius, the god of medicine. While Hebe represented the ideal state of health, Asclepius offered the tangible hope of healing from actual, painful disease. His sanctuaries, like the famous one at Epidaurus, functioned as ancient medical centers where the sick and injured would travel for cures, sleeping in his abaton, a sacred hall, in the hope that the god would visit them in a dream with a diagnosis or remedy. This was a direct, transactional form of worship with a visible, measurable outcome. You prayed to Asclepius when you were sick, and if you got better, your faith was confirmed. Hebe's blessing was more abstract, a general state of well-being that felt less urgent than a specific, miraculous healing from the brink of death. Similarly, the wild, ecstatic mysteries of Dionysus offered a different kind of solace, an escape from the self and the miseries of the mortal condition through ritual madness and the promise of an afterlife. And the Eleusinian mysteries, dedicated to Demeter and Persephone, tackled the ultimate human fear head-on, death itself. They promised initiates a better fate in the underworld, a comfort that the goddess of youthful life by her very nature could not provide. In a world full of pain, people gravitated towards gods who dealt in catharsis, healing, and salvation, leaving the serene goddess of the prime of life in their shadow. Furthermore, the very concept of the divine feminine was undergoing a transformation that left Hebe's particular archetype behind. The idealized, passive maiden, while still a cultural figure, was increasingly joined and often overshadowed by depictions of powerful, active, and sometimes terrifying female divinities. Consider the trajectory of goddesses like Artemis. She began as a virgin huntress, but in her aspect as Artemis Ephesia, evolved into a many-breasted goddess of staggering fertility and nature's raw, untamable power. Athena's influence only grew as the patron of strategic warfare and the cunning intellect needed to navigate an increasingly complex political world. Even Aphrodite, often dismissed as just a love goddess, held sway over the terrifying, irrational forces of desire that could topple empires and break the strongest of wills. These deities represented facets of female divinity that were dynamic, formidable, and directly engaged with the chaotic forces of the world. Hebe, by contrast, remained the graceful, serving daughter. Her power was nurturing and sustaining, but it wasn't commanding. In an era where cities needed fierce protectors and individuals sought powerful allies, her gentle background role felt less and less essential to the harsh realities of daily life. She was a goddess for peaceful, orderly times, and the Hellenistic and Roman ages that followed were anything but. This cultural shift was cemented by the philosophical revolutions that began to reshape how educated elites thought about the gods and the human condition. The schools of Stoicism and Epicureanism, which gained prominence in the later classical and Hellenistic periods, directed the search for the good life inward towards personal virtue, ataraxia, freedom from disturbance, and a rational understanding of the universe. For a Stoic, true vitality wasn't about the youth of the body, which is fleeting and ultimately outside of one's control, but about the unwavering strength of the soul. An Epicurean sought to eliminate pain and fear, not to chase an idealized physical state. In these systems, praying to a goddess for the blessing of youth would have seemed almost naive, a focus on a superficial externality rather than the deep, internal work of achieving wisdom and tranquility. The philosophers offered a framework for dealing with aging and death that didn't require divine intervention, but rather intellectual and moral discipline. While the average person still visited temples and made offerings, the intellectual current of the age was moving away from the kind of simple, personified abstractions that Hebe represented. The concept of youth was being dissected and redefined, no longer just a divine gift but a phase in a life that was to be managed through reason, not just ritual. Finally, we cannot overlook the simple, brutal logistics of history and syncretism. As the Roman Republic expanded and then transformed into the empire, it absorbed and reframed Greek deities, as we saw with Hebe becoming Juventus. While this preserved her name and function, it often stripped away the rich narrative mythology that made these figures resonate on a personal, emotional level. Juventus was a state goddess, a symbolic force in a civic ritual. The charming, complex stories of Hebe as a daughter, a sister, the one who stumbled, the bride of Heracles, these narrative details which gave her humanity and relatability faded in the Roman translation. Furthermore, the rise of Christianity delivered the final blow to the entire Olympian pantheon. The new faith offered a single, all-powerful God of salvation, a definitive victory over death, and a clear moral path, a package that was philosophically and emotionally compelling to a world weary of capricious, quarreling deities. In this new cosmic order, there was no room for a specialized goddess of youth. The yearning for renewal and eternal life was co-opted and fulfilled by the Christian promise of resurrection and a perfect, ageless existence in the kingdom of heaven. Hebe's domain was not destroyed, it was rendered obsolete, its functions absorbed into a grander, more monolithic theological system. Her fading from widespread worship is therefore a quiet echo of a massive cultural quake, the slow closing of a chapter in human history where the blessings of a beautiful, fleeting spring were thought to be in the gift of a smiling, graceful goddess. Yet if we listen closely, we can hear a quiet but persistent call to reclaim her image for our time, to see past the ancient role of passive server and recognize in Hebe a profound and empowering symbol for a new age. This isn't about ignoring her mythology, but about reading between its lines to uncover a deeper resonance for contemporary life. The core of her being, youth, need not be confined to the physical bloom of a teenager or the smooth skin of a young adult. What if we understood it instead as a quality of spirit, a vibrant state of being that is available to anyone at any stage of life who chooses to cultivate it? This reinterpretation transforms Hebe from a beautiful relic into a dynamic archetype of vitality, health, and untapped potential. She becomes the goddess not of being young, but of staying awake to the world, of maintaining curiosity, and of nurturing the inner wellspring of energy that makes growth possible. In a culture often fixated on the superficial signs of aging, this shift is revolutionary. It invites us to stop mourning the loss of our 20s and start cultivating the Hebe energy within us, the part that remains open, flexible, and endlessly capable of renewal. Her power was always to rejuvenate, and that is a force we need now more than ever, not as a denial of age, but as an affirmation of life's continuous capacity for new beginnings. Envision Hebe not with her eyes demurely downcast, holding a cup for others, but standing with a posture of quiet confidence, her picture representing an internal source of vitality that she controls and directs. This reclaimed Hebe is an emblem of self-care and holistic well-being. The nectar she once served to the gods becomes a metaphor for the practices that genuinely sustain us: nourishing food, invigorating movement, restorative sleep, and mindful connection. When we choose to go for a walk in nature, to prepare a meal that truly fuels our body, or to prioritize our mental health, we are, in a modern sense, pouring from Hebe's pitcher for ourselves. She symbolizes the understanding that our vitality is a sacred resource that we are responsible for stewarding. This moves her far beyond the outdated ideal of the eternally youthful maiden whose value is in her appearance and service. Instead, she becomes a guide for integrating body, mind, and spirit. Her energy is the opposite of burnout and world weariness. It is the cultivated resilience that allows us to meet challenges with grace and to recover from setbacks with a spirit of learning. In this light, every person who commits to a journey of health and self-discovery is honoring Hebe's true domain, recognizing that the prime of life is not a date on a calendar, but a state we actively create through our daily choices and conscious intention. Furthermore, this modern Hebe champions the courage of potential. Youth is inherently a time of what if, a period rich with paths not yet taken and identities not yet fully formed. Too often, as we accumulate responsibilities and routines, we allow that sense of potential to narrow, convincing ourselves that our story is largely written. A reclaimed Hebe defiantly protects that inner space of possibility. She represents the part of us that is still willing to learn a new skill, to change a career, to embark on a creative project, or to redefine a relationship regardless of our age. This is not about frivolously chasing every whim, but about maintaining a fundamental openness to becoming more fully ourselves. She is the patron of those who go back to school in their 40s, who start a business in their 50s, or who find a new passion in their 70s. Her power is the antidote to the rigid thinking and "this is just who I am" resignation that can stifle a life. When we embrace this aspect of her, we give ourselves permission to remain apprentices to life, to be beginners again, and to find excitement in the unfolding journey rather than clinging to a fixed and finished identity. The potential Hebe gods is the thrilling and sometimes terrifying understanding that we are never fully done, that there are always new layers to uncover and new ways to grow. This reinterpretation also allows Hebe to stand as a powerful corrective to the darker sides of our youth-obsessed culture. Our modern world often commodifies youth, selling it back to us as a product to be purchased through creams, procedures, and fads, all while fostering a fear of aging that can border on the pathological. This is the shadow of the Hebe archetype, a desperate, externalized clinging to the surface of youth while ignoring its substance. The goddess we are reclaiming offers a different path. She invites us to shift the focus from how we look to how we feel and how we engage with the world. Her vitality is not about erasing wrinkles, but about having the energy to play with our grandchildren, the curiosity to travel and learn, and the emotional flexibility to build deep, meaningful connections throughout our entire lives. She represents a quality of presence that makes every age vibrant. A person with strong Hebe energy radiates a light that has nothing to do with a smooth complexion and everything to do with a lively mind and a generous heart. By looking to her as a symbol of this internal youthfulness, we can disentangle ourselves from the toxic messaging that equates value with the appearance of being 25 and instead celebrate the unique and powerful vitality available at every single chapter of our lives. Ultimately, to reclaim Hebe is to perform an act of profound personal and cultural alchemy. We are taking an ancient figure, once defined by her service to a patriarchal pantheon, and transforming her into a source of personal authority and empowerment. She is no longer a maiden waiting for a role or a husband to define her. She is the sovereign of her own vitality. Her pitcher is not for serving others first, but for ensuring her own cup is full, understanding that from that abundance she can then give to the world in a sustainable and authentic way. This Hebe walks among us today in the teacher who brings infectious enthusiasm to the classroom, in the retiree who volunteers with boundless energy, in the artist who continues to experiment and evolve, and in anyone who chooses to meet the day with a spirit of openness and resilience. She reminds us that the fountain of youth is not a hidden geographical location, but a wellspring within our own being, fed by our choices, our passions, and our unwavering commitment to remain alive to the wonder of existence. By embracing this symbol, we grant ourselves permission to cultivate an eternal spring in our own hearts, to be lifelong learners, and to wear the years not as a burden, but as a testament to a life lived with the enduring, renewable power of youth. As we bring the story of Hebe to a close, we're left with a far richer and more intricate portrait than the simple image of a maiden with a cup. We've traced her journey from the heart of the Olympian family, where her graceful service as cupbearer was the quiet engine of divine immortality, to her pivotal role as the bride of Heracles, a union that healed the deepest rift in the pantheon and redefined her power as a personal, focused source of renewal. We've seen her not just as a beautiful symbol, but as an active force of rejuvenation, a figure whose essence touched upon the deepest human anxieties about aging and the fervent hope for a clean slate. Her legacy unfolded across cultures, transforming in Rome into the state-sponsored Juventus, a goddess who presided over the solemn transition of boys into citizen soldiers, linking the vigor of youth directly to the might of an empire. And yet, despite this profound significance, we also witnessed her gradual fade from widespread worship, a quiet retreat into the background as human concerns shifted toward gods of salvation and philosophies of inner resilience. This exploration reveals a crucial truth about Greek mythology and indeed about history itself. The grand narratives of Zeus, Hera, and Athena provide the epic framework, the thunderous headlines of the divine world. But it is in the stories of figures like Hebe that we find the quiet footnotes, the subtle brushstrokes that complete the picture. Her story is one of essential, often overlooked forms of power. It's the power of service, of sustenance, of gentle influence, and of healing reconciliation. In a pantheon obsessed with thunderbolts and tridents, her authority flowed from a pitcher. This reminds us that the ancient world understood strength in many forms. True power isn't always about command and conquest, but often about the capacity to nurture, to sustain, and to renew. By restoring Hebe to her proper place, we don't just add another name to a list of gods. We restore a vital dimension to our understanding of how the Greeks saw their universe functioning. Her presence was the guarantee of continuity, the ever-flowing spring that ensured the drama of the gods could continue for eternity. Rediscovering these so-called lesser myths does more than just fill in the gaps of an ancient belief system. It holds up a mirror to our own modern world and its values. Our culture, much like the ancient world, is often captivated by the loudest voices and the most dramatic displays of power. We celebrate the innovators, the disruptors, the champions. But what of the quiet sustainers, the teachers, the caregivers, the nurses, the support systems whose steady, often unseen, work is the true foundation upon which everything else is built? Hebe's story is their story. It is a mythic validation of the profound impact made by those who work in the background, whose power lies not in dominating others but in enabling them to thrive. Her narrative challenges us to expand our own definition of significance and to recognize the immense value in the roles that maintain, heal, and quietly hold the world together. Ultimately, the journey to uncover Hebe's untold myth is an invitation to look deeper, to listen for the softer voices in any chorus. It teaches us that history, religion, and story are always more complex and more human than they first appear. Behind every great thunder god, there is a goddess ensuring his cup is never empty. Beyond every epic hero's labors, there is a promise of rest and renewal. These quieter stories enrich our understanding because they speak to the universal, everyday hopes and fears that connect us across millennia: the yearning for health, the dread of decay, the desire for a second chance, and the quiet dignity found in devoted service. Hebe may have been the goddess of youth, but her ultimate lesson is timeless. That true vitality is not merely a matter of endless spring, but the enduring power of grace, the quiet strength found in nurturing others, and the profound impact of the gentle hands that keep the world in